$50 for a burned suitcase? Richard Hawthorne clapped once, slowly. Then he laughed. "Come now, young lady," he said, still smiling broadly at the guests seated below. $50 is more than enough for this piece of junk. Annie's hand tightened around the handle of the scorched leather suitcase. For a moment, she stood so still that some of the guests thought she had finally understood her place. She was wearing an old, worn gray coat, the kind of coat no one in that room would have wanted hanging anywhere near their closet. But her eyes remained fixed on Richard Hawthorne. "No," she said. The sound was not loud, but it cut straight through the laughter around her. Richard tilted his head. "No?" Annie stepped closer to the display table. "No, Mr. Hawthorne, do you think your $50 is so much? Do you think that just because you say a number into a microphone, the whole world has to bow to it?" A few guests stopped laughing. A woman slowly lowered her glass of champagne. Annie lifted her chin. "This suitcase is worth $1 million. For a split second, the entire hall seemed to freeze. Then Richard laughed even louder than before. He threw his head back as if Annie had just given him the greatest entertainment of the evening. $1 million? He repeated. "For this thing?" He turned toward the guests and raised a hand, inviting them to look. "Ladies and gentlemen, please look at this suitcase. Look at it carefully. It is not even intact. One side is burned black, the leather is cracked, the corners are dented, and the lock looks as if it survived a fire, then lost the fight afterward." He turned back to Annie, his smile growing sharper. "And you stand here demanding $1 million. Who do you think you are?" Annie's face burned, but she did not step away from the suitcase. It lay on the polished table like an old wound put on display. One side was scorched almost completely black. The brass lock had darkened with time and heat. The handle was worn smooth in the middle, as if someone had held it for many years. Richard slowly took 2 more steps toward it. "To be honest," he said, deliberately lowering his voice as if he were being kind, "at first I was going to offer $10. Laughter rose again from the tables near the front. Richard lifted one hand, but then I thought, "No, Richard, don't be too cruel. She must have come a long way to get here. She carried this thing in by herself. Maybe it has sentimental value. Maybe she needs bus fare." He smiled at Annie as if kindness had just overflowed from his heart. "So I will make my final offer. $50. $50 for the burned suitcase." He turned back to the crowd. "What do you all think?" $50. Fair, isn't it?" This time, the laughter grew louder. A man near the stage slapped his hand against the table. Someone in the back muttered, "More than fair." Another guest said, "She should take it." Annie heard all of it. Evelyn Price, the auction director, stood beside the podium, holding her note cards tightly against her chest. She had managed charity auctions for governors, judges, museum boards, and families who owned more silverware than some small-town libraries owned books. "Mr. Hawthorne," Evelyn said carefully, "perhaps we should allow the consignor to provide documentation before we refuse the item." Richard did not even look at her. "Evelyn, paperwork does not turn garbage into gold." Annie answered before Evelyn could say another word. "No, but ignorance can make people throw gold into the trash." Richard's smile remained on his lips, but his eyes tightened. "You should be careful with your words," he said. "Why?" Annie asked. "Because I embarrassed you? You embarrassed yourself the moment you assumed something had no value simply because the person carrying it did not look rich." A murmur spread through the tables. Richard leaned closer to the microphone. "Young lady, this is my auction. These people came here for a formal evening, not to watch a street performance." Annie placed her palm on the suitcase. "Then let's be formal properly." "Really?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "You bring in a half-burned suitcase and demand $1 million. I stated its value. You stated a fantasy. You refused to listen. I have heard enough." "No," Annie said. "You have laughed enough." Richard straightened the front of his jacket. For the first time, his voice softened, but it was not true gentleness. It was the false kind, the tone people use when they want to insult someone, while still looking as though they are granting a favor. "All right," he said, reaching into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. "Since you seem determined to turn my kindness into a joke, I will give you one final chance." He pulled out a crisp $50 bill and held it between 2 fingers. The whole room watched. Richard stepped down from the stage and stopped close enough for Annie to smell the expensive cologne on his lapel. He smiled as though he were granting her a privilege the whole world should applaud. "I will leave the burned suitcase here," he said quietly, though the microphone near the table still picked up every word clearly. and you will take this $50 and get out of my sight." Annie looked at the bill, then she looked at Richard. For a few seconds, no one moved. The chandeliers above them trembled slightly. Somewhere in the back, a fork touched a plate, and then stopped. Annie reached out and took the $50 bill. Richard's smile grew brighter. Then Annie folded the bill once. Not carefully, not respectfully. Then she threw it hard against his chest. The bill struck his expensive suit and fell to the floor between them. A shocked gasp rose from the front row. Annie did not look down at the money. $1 million, she said. That is its price. Richard stared at the bill on the floor as if it had slapped him harder than any hand could have. When he lifted his head, the mask of politeness had fallen away. "You insolent brat," he hissed. Evelyn hurried forward one step. "Mr. Hawthorne." "No," Richard snapped, his eyes still fixed on Annie. "I want everyone to witness this. I want every person in this room to see what happens when kindness is thrown back in a man's face." He stepped closer to the suitcase. "I do charity. I host this auction. I help people. And yet a child with a burned suitcase tries to turn me into a joke." He turned toward the crowd, his voice rising. "Is this what it has come to now? My kindness becoming a stage for some little girl's delusions?" Annie's fingers curled at her sides, but she said nothing. Richard looked down at the suitcase with disgust. $1 million, he repeated, almost laughing through his anger. "For this thing." Then he lifted his polished leather shoe and kicked the side of the suitcase hard. The sound echoed across the hall. The suitcase shifted, but it did not fall. The scorched leather scraped against the polished table leg. The brass lock caught the chandelier light for one brief moment. Richard gave a cold sneer and pointed at it. "Well," he said loudly, "this piece of trash is sturdier than it looks." Annie's eyes moved from the suitcase to Richard's face. Whatever pain had been there before seemed to disappear. In its place was something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. "You're right," she replied. Richard blinked. "What?" "It is sturdier than it looks." Annie reached into the pocket of her old coat and took out a small, darkened key. Richard saw it and laughed again, though this time the laugh was shorter. "What is this now? A magic trick?" "No," Annie said. "A correction." She lifted the suitcase onto the center of the display table. The burned leather made a dry sound as it touched the polished wood. Richard's expression slowly grew serious. Annie slid the key into the lock. "You had a chance to buy it for $1 million, she said. "But you valued it at only 50 because you thought I was nobody." The lock resisted. Annie slowly turned the key, patient and steady. She kept one hand on the lid, then looked at Richard one last time before opening it. "You asked me who I thought I was," she said. "Maybe you should have asked yourself what you were laughing at." Then she lifted the lid of the suitcase. "What are you trying to do?" Richard Hawthorne asked. His voice cut through the silence at the exact moment Annie opened the suitcase. Annie did not answer right away. Richard stepped closer. "I asked you a question." Annie kept one hand on the open lid. "I heard you. Then answer me." She looked up at him. "I am not trying to do anything, Mr. Hawthorne. I am simply opening the thing you just called trash." A few guests near the front table shifted in their seats. Evelyn Price stood beside the podium, pressing her note cards tightly against her chest, as if they were the only thing keeping her calm. Richard glanced quickly toward the crowd, then back at Annie. "That little performance may impress people who enjoy drama," he said, "but this is still an auction. You cannot turn it into a stage just because your pride has been wounded." "My dignity is still intact," Annie replied. Richard gave a small laugh. "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "The suitcase is what you kicked." Richard's jaw tightened. He looked down at the scratched edge of the suitcase, then around the hall, as if searching for the familiar laughter that had stood with him only minutes earlier. But this time, the laughter was gone. A few guests avoided his eyes. An elderly man removed his glasses and began cleaning them far too carefully, as if he needed a reason not to look directly at what was happening in front of him. Richard forced a smile. "It seems to have survived worse." "Yes," Annie said, "but just because something has survived damage does not mean you have the right to cause more." Richard's face hardened for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Men like Richard Hawthorne had spent their entire lives practicing how to turn discomfort into power. "Fine," he said. "Then show us. Since you insist on wasting everyone's evening, show us your $1 million miracle." Annie reached into the suitcase and lifted out a wrapped bundle with both hands. Her movements were careful, almost ceremonial. "Please clear the table for me," she said. Evelyn looked at Richard. then seemed to regret having looked to him for permission. She turned to the attendants. "Clear the table." 2 young staff members stepped forward and removed the silver tray, the auction cards, and the crystal bowl filled with donation badges. Annie placed the carefully wrapped bundle in the center of the polished wooden table. Richard folded his arms. "Let me guess. A sad letter? A map to buried treasure? Or some antique dealer's story about how smoke damage increases value?" Annie untied the ribbon. "You talk too much for someone who said he had heard enough." Richard's eyes narrowed. Annie slowly opened the cloth wrapping. Inside was a thick sheet of technical drawing paper, old ivory at the center, darkened by smoke along the edges. Fine black ink lines covered the surface. Foundation grids, support columns, service tunnels, elevation marks, water routes, and load calculations written by hand along the margins. In the lower right corner, beside a black ink signature, was a clear stamped seal, a crane standing beneath an 8-pointed star. The people seated closest to the table instinctively leaned forward. A woman wearing a pearl necklace quickly took out her reading glasses. A man who had been laughing only minutes earlier went still, his drink frozen halfway to his mouth. Richard glanced down and shrugged too quickly. "Building plans. This is an original draft," Annie said. "Hand drawn in ink. Not a copy. And are we supposed to accept that just because you say so?" "No," Annie replied. "You are supposed to accept it because the paper, the ink, the seal, and the signature say so." Evelyn stepped closer before she could stop herself. Veteran auctioneers developed an instinct much like farmers reading the weather. They knew when an old object was merely old, and when it carried a value that had been sleeping inside it. Evelyn's eyes moved across the page. "The handwriting style is early 20th century, she said quietly. "The paper appears consistent as well." Richard immediately looked at her. "Evelyn," she paused, but she did not take back what she had said. Annie removed a second sheet, then a third. Each page bore the same seal, the same steady handwriting, the same signature. These were not decorative drawings meant to hang in a sitting room. They were construction plans. Someone had imagined an entire city on these sheets before that city ever existed. Richard leaned forward despite himself. "Where did you get these?" Annie looked straight at him. "I understand very well. When you thought the suitcase had no value, you wanted me gone. Now that you think it may have value, you want to know where I got it." The entire room heard her. And more importantly, Richard knew the entire room had heard her. He forced a smile. Any responsible buyer would ask that question. "When you offered $50 for it, you were not acting like a responsible buyer." "I was being generous. You were paying to be entertained." Evelyn lowered her face. The elderly man with the glasses stopped cleaning them. Annie reached for a small wooden box inside the suitcase. Richard's voice came too quickly. "Don't open that." Everyone turned to look at him. For a moment, Richard himself seemed startled by his own urgency. Then he smoothed the front of his jacket and forced his voice to sound calmer. "If it is fragile, it should be handled by a specialist." Annie looked down at the scratched edge of the suitcase. "You kicked it before you cared whether it was fragile." Richard pressed his mouth shut. Annie placed the wooden box on the table. The latch opened with a small, dry click. Inside, resting on black velvet, was an old gold badge, a crane with its wings spread beneath an 8-pointed star. Smoke had darkened the edges of the metal, but the engraving remained sharp. On the back were 3 words: Whitaker Rose Founding Trust. Evelyn breathed out softly. "Me God." The name immediately spread through the hall in whispers. Whitaker Rose. Some guests did not recognize it. Others did, and their expressions changed. Richard stood frozen. Annie lifted the badge only long enough for those nearest to see it, then placed it beside the drawings. "This badge is issued to only one family representative at a time," she said. "It has never been sold publicly. It has never been duplicated for display. It authenticates the documents that accompany it." Richard stared at the badge. A thin line of sweat appeared near his temple. Then he looked back at Annie's worn old coat, as if the poor fabric had suddenly become a puzzle he could not solve. "And how exactly does a girl dressed like you have possession of a Whitaker Rose badge?" Annie's expression did not change. "There it is again." "What?" "The assumption." Richard spread his hands. "That is a reasonable question." "No," Annie said. "That is a question dressed in polite clothing so prejudice can enter the room without taking off its hat." Near the side wall, an older black waiter stood very still, holding a tray. Annie saw his eyes lift for half a second. He understood that sentence in his bones. even if he had never heard those exact words before. Richard's cheeks reddened. "You are being very offensive. I became offensive to you the moment I refused your $50. Before Richard could respond, a man rose from a table near the back. He was tall, silver-haired, and dressed in a plain dark suit with no display of wealth. Until that moment, he had been almost invisible among the crowd, and that was often the safest position for a lawyer. "Mr. Hawthorne," the man said, "the young woman has every legal right to possess, present, and authenticate that badge." Richard turned sharply. "And who are you?" "Martin Cole, attorney for the Whitaker Rose family." Richard's face went pale. Annie did not turn around to look at Martin. She kept her eyes on Richard, because he had asked who she thought she was, and she wanted the answer to reach him one piece at a time. Evelyn stepped closer to the table, her voice much softer now. "Miss, may I ask what these drawings are?" Annie touched the lower edge of the first sheet. "These are the original foundation designs for what later became Orion." The name fell into the room like an alarm bell. Orion Corporation. Everyone in that room knew the name, even those who pretended not to follow business news. They knew the towers, the technology complexes, the luxury residential districts, the private infrastructure contracts, the data centers, the cities reshaped by its influence. And they also knew that Richard Hawthorne had spent years trying to buy controlling power over Orion. He wanted control of Orion more than any deal in his life. Annie continued, her voice frighteningly calm. "The first planning grid, the original utility model, the earliest multi-use infrastructure concept. This signature belongs to Augustus Whitaker, my great-great-grandfather, whose work was later buried under the names of other men, because history has always been kinder to those holding the microphone." Richard swallowed. Annie gently turned the page so the seal faced him. "This is the beginning of the company you have spent the last 7 years trying to control. If Annie's courage moved you, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your voice helps stories like this reach more people who believe in truth, dignity, and justice. And if you want more powerful stories, please subscribe to the channel." Richard looked back at the papers on the table, but now they no longer looked like old papers. They looked like evidence, like history, like a door that had opened right in front of him, revealing a truth he had spent his entire life believing he was rich enough to walk past without asking permission. Richard Hawthorne did not move for several seconds. That was how Annie knew he understood. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. The name Orion had reached into him and found the place where ambition lived. A man could laugh at a burned suitcase. He could kick it, mock the girl who carried it, and toss a $50 bill at her like a bone. But he could not laugh at Orion Group, not when he had spent 7 years trying to pry open its doors. Evelyn Price looked from the drawings to Richard. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said carefully, "perhaps we should pause the auction and allow a formal authentication." Richard turned his head slowly. "No." The word came out quiet, but everyone heard the command inside it. Evelyn blinked. "No?" No pause. He forced his smile back into place, though it no longer fit the moment. "This young lady has made an interesting presentation. That is all. Old papers, a family crest, a dramatic story. We should be careful before turning a charity evening into a corporate history lecture." Annie closed the lid of the wooden box halfway, leaving the crest visible. "You were happy to turn it into a comedy show when you thought I was poor." A few people at the front tables looked down. Richard gave her a look meant to warn, but Annie had already seen the worst of him. Warnings lose power after the truth arrives. He stepped closer to the table, his voice lowered. "Miss Whitaker? Rose, is it?" Annie did not help him. Richard swallowed the name as though it had a bitter edge. "Miss Whitaker, Rose, surely you understand this is not the proper venue for materials of this nature. I tried to explain their nature before you kicked them. You keep returning to that, because you keep trying to walk away from it." The old gentleman with reading glasses made a small sound in his throat. Not quite approval, but close enough to make Richard's eyes flick toward him. Martin Cole moved nearer to the table. "Mr. Hawthorne, for the record, the item was accepted into the auction catalog under your own submission rules. Miss Whitaker, Rose, has the right to present provenance." Richard looked at him. "Counselor, I have no interest in being lectured on rules at my own event." "Then you should not have written them down," Martin said. The line was so dry, so calm, that it took a second for the room to understand it. Then a low murmur moved through the guests. Not laughter this time. Something better. Recognition. Richard hated it. He turned back to Annie and changed tactics. His shoulders relaxed. His voice warmed. And the expression he used for cameras returned, softened at the edges. All right. Let us start over. Annie waited. I may have misjudged the situation, he said. You misjudged the person. His smile twitched. Fair enough. The person and the situation. He glanced at the drawings. These are remarkable. If they are what you say they are, then perhaps we can handle this privately, away from noise, away from embarrassment. Whose embarrassment? That stopped him. Annie watched the answer pass across his face before he buried it. Richard reached for patience. Annie, may I call you Annie? No. A woman near the center table almost choked on her sip of water. Richard's smile held by force. Miss Whitaker, Rose, he corrected. I am prepared to make a serious offer. The room stirred. Annie said nothing. Richard took her silence as permission. Men like him often did. $2 million for the suitcase and its contents. Pending authentication. Martin Cole's eyes narrowed slightly, but he did not interrupt. Annie looked at the $50 bill still lying on the marble floor near Richard's polished shoe. Nobody had picked it up. It looked smaller now than it had when he held it out like mercy. You offered $50 a few minutes ago, she said. Richard gave a soft laugh. And now I have more information. That is how markets work. No, Annie said. That is how character exposes itself. The room held still. Richard breathed through his nose. 5 million. Several guests turned fully toward him. Annie folded the cloth back over one of the drawings, not to hide it, but to protect it from the air. You are still bidding on the wrong thing. I am bidding on the suitcase. No, you are bidding on the chance to pretend you recognized its value before everyone watched you insult it. Richard's face tightened. He leaned closer, dropping his voice. You may be enjoying this now, but you should understand what you're holding. Items like this do not belong in the hands of someone who wants applause more than discretion. Annie's eyes did not leave his. That sounds like advice from a man who confuses ownership with silence. Martin Cole stepped in, his tone even. Be careful, Mr. Hawthorne. Richard straightened, annoyed. I am making a generous offer. You are making a frightened one, Annie said. That did it. For a moment, the mask slipped again, and the anger underneath looked older than the man himself. He had not built his empire by being laughed at, corrected, or refused in public. He had built it by entering rooms where people already knew the price of saying no to him. 10 million, he said. The number fell across the hall. No one laughed. No one whispered. Even the waiters near the wall seemed afraid to move. Richard looked around, regaining a little strength from the shock he had produced. $10 million, right now. For an item you walked in here with under your arm. Annie looked at him almost sadly. And yet, when you thought I had nothing, you told me to take $50 and get out of your sight. That was before. Before what? He did not answer quickly enough. Before you knew my name? Annie asked. Before you saw the crest? Before Orion was spoken out loud? Richard's jaw worked. She touched the suitcase lid, the place where his shoe had struck it. You did not learn anything new about me, Mr. Hawthorne. You only learned that disrespecting me might cost you something. A man in the back whispered, Lord. Evelyn heard it. So did Richard. His eyes moved toward the cameras. The red recording lights were still on. That realization passed through him like a blade. Everything had been captured. The $50 insult, the thrown bill, the kick, the sudden offer of millions. Every second of it. Turn those off, he said. No one moved. He looked toward the camera crew. Turn them off. One of the operators hesitated and glanced at Evelyn. Evelyn lifted her chin. The event contract permits full coverage of auction proceedings. Richard stared at her. For the first time that evening, Evelyn did not look away. Something shifted then, small but real. A room can belong to one man for years, and still, in a single moment, begin to remember it has doors. Richard lowered his voice again, but this time the softness was gone. 25 million. The guests drew in breath. Annie looked at the drawings, then at the crest, then at Richard. She could feel the weight of Clara's instructions from that morning, though her grandmother was nowhere in the room. Do not reveal everything too soon. Let him show you what he worships before you tell him what he lost. Richard took her silence for hesitation. $25 million, Miss Whitaker rose. That is not an insult. That is respect. No, Annie said. That is panic with commas. A few faces in the room changed again. Some admired her, some feared for her, some were only now realizing how expensive their laughter had become. Richard's voice sharpened. You are 18 years old and standing in a room full of people who understand business. Do not mistake a clever sentence for leverage. Annie smiled faintly, the first smile she had allowed herself all evening. Do not mistake age for ignorance. Plenty of men have gray hair and still confuse price with value. The old gentleman with the reading glasses nodded once before he caught himself. Richard saw it. His pride could not survive many more public wounds. He turned to Martin. Is this a negotiation or a performance? Martin answered, That depends. Are you making an offer or trying to buy your way out of shame? Richard's face darkened. Counselor. Annie gently lifted one final sheet from the suitcase. Unlike the others, this one was smaller, folded once, with a seal pressed in dark red wax. She did not open it yet. She only let Richard see the outside, his eyes fixed on it. There, in ink faded brown with age, were the words, Orion Founding Allocation, Private Trust Copy. Richard stopped breathing for half a second. Annie saw it. So did Martin. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. Where did you get that? Annie placed the document beside the crest. From the same place you have spent 7 years trying to reach. The hall seemed to draw inward around them. Richard no longer looked like a host. He looked like a man standing outside a locked gate, seeing through the bars the one thing he had never been able to buy. He wet his lips. Miss Whitaker. Rose. I think we should speak privately. Annie closed the suitcase lid halfway. Enough to shield the documents, but not enough to end the moment. You had privacy when you decided who I was. I think we'll stay in public now. The words left him with nowhere to stand. Outside the tall windows of Whitmore Grand Hall, the autumn night pressed dark against the glass. Inside, beneath the chandeliers and painted ceilings, Richard Hawthorne looked at the girl he had mocked, the suitcase he had kicked, and the history he had tried to purchase without ever respecting the hands that carried it. For the first time in years, no number came to him fast enough. Richard Hawthorne had spent most of his adult life learning how to recover a room, a bad headline, a hostile shareholder, a senator with questions, a widow refusing to sell land her husband had promised a way. Richard knew how to soften, delay, charm, threaten, or write a number large enough to make resistance look foolish. But standing beside that open suitcase, with the words Orion Founding Allocation still visible on the folded document, he felt the room slipping from his hands in a way money could not immediately fix. He adjusted his cufflinks. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but Annie saw it. Men like Richard did not touch their clothing because it needed straightening. They did it when they needed a second to hide panic. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard said, turning toward the crowd with a smile that had been rebuilt too quickly. I think we can all agree this has become more complicated than a normal auction item. No one answered. Complicated, Annie repeated. Richard looked back at her. Yes, complicated. And when valuable materials are involved, responsible people do not make decisions under chandeliers with cameras pointed at them. You had no problem making decisions here when you thought it was trash. His smile thinned. I have already acknowledged that I may have spoken too lightly. You called it garbage. You kicked it. A woman near the second table looked down at her lap. A man who had laughed earlier pressed his napkin to his mouth and pretended to cough. Richard's eyes narrowed. You are very determined to keep this unpleasant. No, Annie said. I am determined not to let you make it polite. Martin Cole stood a few feet behind her, close enough to intervene but not close enough to take her place. That mattered. Annie knew it. So did Richard. Martin could have spoken for her in the language of filings and trusts. But Annie's silence had been mocked and her dignity had been priced at $50. This part belonged to her. Richard stepped closer to the table and lowered his voice. Miss Whitaker, Rose, I'm going to speak plainly. If that allocation document is authentic, and if those drawings are what you say they are, they do not belong in this room. They belong wherever their owner chooses to bring them. And you are the owner? Annie held his gaze. You already know the answer. You are only asking because you do not like it. A small rustle moved through the hall. Richard turned his head slightly, enough to remind the room he could still hear them. Then he did something almost convincing. He softened. He let his shoulders drop. He put away the anger and put on concern, the kind he used when cameras asked him about poverty, education, or neighborhoods his companies had priced families out of. Annie, he said, ignoring the fact that she had already refused him permission to use her first name. "I owe you an apology." The room waited. Annie did not help him. Richard placed one hand over his chest. "I was out of line. I made a joke in poor taste, and I let the moment run away from me. That is on me." It was a clean apology if one did not listen too closely. It apologized for taste, not contempt. For the moment, not the man. Evelyn Price watched Annie with the look of an older woman hoping the younger one would understand the difference. Annie did. Richard continued, "Let me repair it. Publicly. Properly. I will purchase the suitcase for $50 million. Subject to verification. And I will announce tonight that the acquisition honors the Whitaker Rose contribution to American enterprise." Several guests gasped. 50 million sounded like a number large enough to become morality in certain rooms. Richard heard the reaction and grew steadier. "And I will ensure your family receives full credit." Annie almost smiled. "Ensure?" "Yes. You will ensure my family receives credit for what my family already owns?" His expression tightened. "That is not what I meant. It is exactly what you meant. You want to buy the beginning, and then be praised for admitting who built it." Martin Cole lowered his eyes for a second. Not to hide disagreement, but to hide approval. Richard's voice cooled. "You are making this difficult." "No," Annie said. "You are discovering that I am not for sale at the speed you prefer." The folded allocation document sat between them like a sealed verdict. Richard could not stop looking at it. That was when Annie knew the paper mattered even more than the drawings. The designs proved origin. The crest proved family authority. But the allocation might prove control, and control was the only language Richard had never needed translated. He pointed at the folded document. "Open it." Annie did not move. "If you want this room to believe you, open it." This room did not need proof to laugh at me. That is not an answer. "No," Annie said. "It is a reminder." Richard exhaled through his nose. "Fine. 100 million. The room stirred so sharply that chair legs scraped the floor. Evelyn whispered, "My God." Richard kept his eyes on Annie. He had found his footing again, or thought he had. $100 million. Not 50. Not 25. 100. Tonight. I will have my attorneys draft the agreement before midnight." Annie glanced at the $50 bill still on the floor. No one had touched it. It had become a small paper witness, lying where his pity had fallen. "You move quickly," she said. "When something is valuable, when something benefits you, those are often the same thing in business. And that is why people like you should not be trusted with things that outlive business." Richard's eyes flickered. "Careful. There it is again." "What?" "You keep asking me to be careful after you have been careless with everything that mattered." The words took some of the breath out of the hall. Richard leaned in, voice low enough that only those nearest could hear, though the microphones caught fragments. "You are young. You think dignity is enough. It isn't. Not in courts. Not in boardrooms. Not when families start fighting among themselves over money. I can make this clean for you." Annie answered just as quietly. "You mean quiet?" "I mean clean." "No," she said. "You mean quiet. Clean is what people call silence when they can afford better lawyers." For the first time, Richard looked at Martin instead of Annie. "Counselor, you should advise your client." Martin replied, "I am." Richard waited. Martin added, "I am advising her by not interrupting." A few guests shifted again. The room had begun to enjoy Richard's discomfort in the careful way wealthy rooms enjoy anything dangerous from a safe distance. Richard felt it and changed tactics once more. "Think carefully, Miss Whitaker. Rose. $100 million does not simply change a life. It can change communities, scholarships, housing, clinics. You walk away from that, and people will ask why." Annie's face changed, just slightly. Richard saw it. There. He had found a door. He stepped through quickly. "That is not a threat. It is reality. You came here to make a point, and you made it. But pride can be expensive when other people could benefit from your yes." The sentence was smooth, too smooth. It sounded almost noble if a person forgot who had kicked the suitcase. Annie looked toward the back of the hall, where several servers stood along the wall. Some were older, working with the quiet discipline of people who had spent years being invisible in rooms that depended on them. One woman held a coffee pot in both hands and watched Annie with an expression that said she had seen many men confuse money with mercy. Annie thought of her grandmother's voice that morning, firm and tired in the family library. Never sell the front door of your family's house to a man who laughed at the people who built it. Richard mistook her silence for weakness. 100 million, he repeated. And I will add a public apology. Annie looked back at him. You are trying to buy the apology too. I am trying to resolve this. No, you are trying to own the evidence of your own mistake. His face hardened. Do you want justice or theater? Annie placed her hand on the suitcase. Justice is what remains when theater stops working. The room went quiet again, but this time the quiet was with her. Richard's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again. He glanced down, irritated, and saw the name of his chief acquisition officer. Another message followed from his general counsel. Then a third. Someone had seen the live stream. Someone outside the room had heard the word Orion. For the first time that evening, the consequences were moving faster than Richard could command them. Annie saw him read the screen. So, she said, now the rest of your people know. Richard put the phone away. This has gone far enough. It went too far when you put your foot on my family's history. His eyes flashed. Your family's history? Do you have any idea how many people built Orion after those drawings? Engineers, contractors, investors, executives, men and women who did the real work while families like yours sat behind trusts. Martin's voice sharpened. Mr. Hawthorne, but Annie raised one hand slightly, stopping him. She looked at Richard, and the anger in her was no longer cold. It was clear. My great-great-grandfather drew the first foundation by hand in a country that would let men use his mind before it would let them use his name. My family stayed quiet because quiet was sometimes the price of survival. But do not stand in front of me, after offering $50 for his work, and tell me who did the real work. Richard did not answer. He could not. Not without showing more of himself than he wanted the cameras to keep. Annie reached for the folded allocation document. The room leaned forward as one body. Richard's voice came low and urgent. Do not open that unless you are prepared for what follows. Annie broke the seal. The old wax gave way with a soft crack. She unfolded the paper slowly, and the first line became visible under the chandelier light. Evelyn stepped closer and read before she could stop herself. Founding allocation of controlling interest. The words were enough. Richard's face emptied. Annie laid the document flat beside the crest. This is why your offers failed, she said. This is why every door closed. You were never negotiating with a rumor. You were negotiating with us. Richard stared at the paper, then at Annie. The girl in the old coat had not brought a suitcase to his auction. She had brought the wall his ambition had been breaking itself against for 7 years. Richard Hawthorne looked at the document as if it had been placed there to accuse him personally. Founding allocation of controlling interest. 5 words, old ink, plain paper. And they had done what 7 years of advisors, private bankers, acquisition teams, and late-night calls could not do. They had brought the invisible hand behind Orion into the open. Worse, they had done it in front of cameras, donors, journalists, waiters, rivals, and every guest who had laughed when he called the suitcase trash. Annie left the paper on the table. She did not push it toward him. She did not snatch it away. She let it sit there under the chandelier light. Because truth did not need to chase anyone once it had arrived. Richard's voice came back in pieces. That document needs verification. Martin Cole answered before Annie could. It has been verified. Richard turned on him. By whom? 3 independent archival firms. 2 corporate historians. 1 federal records examiner. The chain of custody is complete. Richard's mouth tightened. Convenient. No, Martin said. Careful. The word landed with quiet force. Careful was what Richard had not been. Careful was what Annie had been since the moment she entered the hall. Careful was what her family had been for generations while men like Richard mistook silence for weakness. Annie folded her hands in front of her. The originals were never missing. Mr. Hawthorne. They were protected. Protected from what? She looked at him. Men who believe everything becomes theirs once they want it badly enough. The hall gave no sound. Even the service staff stood still along the walls. A coffee pot hung halfway over a cup. A white-haired woman at the second table gripped her husband's sleeve. Evelyn Price did not look at Richard now. She looked only at the documents, as if she were seeing the auction table become a courtroom. Richard gave a short breath through his nose. You enjoy making speeches. No, Annie said. I enjoy being heard after being mocked. That answer did not leave him much to strike. His phone buzzed again. This time he did not check it. He already knew the kind of messages waiting there. His chief acquisition officer would be asking whether the live stream was real. His general counsel would be telling him not to say another word. Someone from investor relations would be panicking over clips spreading before dessert had even been served. Richard glanced toward the cameras. The red recording lights were steady. "Cut the feed," he said. The camera operators looked toward Evelyn. Richard's voice rose. "I said cut it." Evelyn stood straighter. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not. "The media agreement allows coverage until the close of the auction. I own this event. You sponsor it," Evelyn said. "There is a difference." The room felt that difference. It was small, but it opened like a crack in stone. Richard stared at her. Evelyn was old enough to have spent a lifetime smiling at men who thought a check gave them manners. She had compromised often. Most people did, in small ways, to keep jobs, reputations, invitations, but there are moments late in life when a person grows tired of watching the same cruelty wear a new tuxedo. Evelyn looked frightened, but she did not step back. Annie saw it and gave the slightest nod. Richard saw that too, and it angered him more than Evelyn's refusal. The room was moving away from him one person at a time. He turned to Annie and lowered his voice. "Let's stop pretending this is about dignity. You came here to provoke me. I came here to present an item. With cameras rolling, at your auction, with a ridiculous price, with the correct price. You dressed like that on purpose." Annie did not deny it. Richard seized on the silence. "There it is. You wanted this. You wanted me to react. I wanted to see how you would treat someone you thought had nothing." A murmur moved through the hall. Richard's eyes narrowed. "That is manipulation." "No," Annie said. "That is measurement." He gave a humorless laugh. "Measurement? Yes. My grandmother says a person's first insult tells you more than their finest speech." Richard's expression changed at the word grandmother. "Clara." It slipped out before he could stop it. Annie watched him. "So you do know the name." Richard recovered quickly, but not fully. "Everyone in my world knows Clara Whitaker." "Rose, your world," Annie said. "That is an interesting phrase. My professional world. The world where you wanted her signature but would not have recognized her granddaughter unless she arrived dressed in money." Richard's face reddened. Martin Cole stepped closer, but Annie did not need him yet. Richard looked at the crest, then the allocation, then the drawings. When he spoke again, the anger was wrapped in business. "Fine. Since this is a test, let me pass it now." Annie's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I apologize," Richard said, louder for the room. "For the joke, for the kick, for the disrespect. I should have listened before speaking." The apology was better than the first one, but it still arrived after the price had changed. That was the trouble with late humility. It always had a receipt attached. Annie said, "Why are you sorry?" Richard blinked. "I just told you." "No, you told me what you did. I asked why you were sorry." He paused too long. Someone near the back shifted. Annie helped him, but not kindly. "Are you sorry because I am a Whitaker, Rose, or because you humiliated a young woman you thought was beneath you?" Richard's eyes hardened again. "You are determined to make this impossible. It was simple until you made it expensive." A low sound passed through the crowd, something between agreement and discomfort. Richard looked at Martin. 150 million. Martin said nothing. Richard looked back at Annie. 200 million. Final offer for the suitcase, the documents, and a private meeting with Clara Whitaker. Rose. Annie stood very still. The number was enormous. Even in that room, where people spoke of millions as if discussing weather, 200 million had weight. It could renovate schools, endow scholarships, save family farms, restore churches, fund clinics, rebuild neighborhoods forgotten by men who later put their names on charity plaques. Annie was not immune to the size of it. She knew what money could do when held by decent hands. Richard saw the flicker in her face and softened his voice. "Think beyond yourself." That was the wrong sentence. Annie looked at him, and whatever hesitation had touched her disappeared. "Beyond myself?" she said. "Yes. This could help people." "It could." "Then say yes." "To you?" "To the offer." "There is no offer separate from the man making it." Richard's mouth tightened. Annie looked around the room, then back to him. "You keep trying to make me sound selfish for refusing money you only offered after you learned I had power. But when you thought I was poor, Your generosity was $50 and in order to disappear. Richard said nothing. Do you know what my grandmother told me before I came here? Annie asked. He did not answer. She said never sell the front door of your family's house to a man who laughed at the people who built it. The line moved through the hall and stayed there. An older black waiter near the wall lowered his tray to a side table. A woman in pearls wiped the corner of her eye and looked ashamed of herself for doing it so late. Evelyn Price closed her cue cards and held them at her side, as if the auction had become something no card could manage. Richard leaned close enough that only the front rows and microphones could catch him clearly. Be careful, Miss Whitaker. Rose, pride can cost families more than money. Martin's voice came sharp. That sounded like a threat. Richard did not look away from Annie. It was advice. Annie smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Your advice keeps arriving dressed as a warning. Richard stepped back. He knew he had overreached. He could feel the cameras, the room, the phones in guests' hands. He could feel control leaking through the cracks. Annie reached down and picked up the $50 bill from the floor. For a second, Richard looked relieved, as if the gesture meant some kind of reconciliation. She smoothed the bill on the table beside the founding allocation. This, she said, touching the 50, is what you offered when you thought you were judging trash. Then she touched the old document. And this is what you were really standing in front of. She lifted the $50 bill and handed it to Evelyn. Please add this to the auction record, Annie said. Not as a bid, as evidence. Evelyn took it slowly. Evidence of what? Annie looked at Richard. Of the first honest number Mr. Hawthorne gave tonight. Richard's face went pale with fury. Annie closed the wooden box, gathered the crest, and began placing the documents back into their protective cloths. Every movement was calm, final, controlled. Richard watched the future he wanted being wrapped away from him. You cannot just walk out, he said. Annie looked up. I can. We are not finished. No, Mr. Hawthorne, she said. You are not finished wanting. That is not the same thing. Martin Cole stepped beside her and lifted the suitcase from the table after she closed it. The latch clicked shut with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Richard's voice dropped. Name your real price. Annie paused. For one brief moment, the whole hall seemed to lean toward her. She turned back, her old coat hanging loose, her posture straighter than anyone else in the room. You already named it, she said. $50. Then she walked away from the table, and this time the crowd parted without being asked. The space between Annie and the doors opened slowly, not because the guests respected her all at once, but because they no longer knew what touching her might cost. That was the first honest thing the room had done all night. People who had laughed at her shoes now pulled their chairs in. Women who had whispered behind crystal glasses lowered their eyes. Men who had built careers on reading power could finally see it, and because they saw it too late, they stepped aside with the awkward shame of those who had mistaken a crown for a beggar's hat. Annie walked without hurry. Martin Cole kept one hand beneath the suitcase. Not because she could not carry it, but because every person in that hall now understood the object had become evidence, inheritance, and judgment at once. Evelyn Price stood near the table holding Richard's $50 bill between her fingers as if it were something dirty she had not yet decided where to put. Richard did not follow at first. He stood where Annie had left him, under the chandelier light, with the cameras still facing him and the crowd no longer laughing on command. For a man who had spent his life turning exits into negotiations, being left behind was a new kind of insult. His lips parted once, closed, then parted again. Miss Whitaker, Rose. Annie stopped, but she did not turn. That alone made Richard's face harden. He was used to people turning when he said their names. He tried again, softer, because softness had worked for him with frightened bankers, ambitious mayors, aging heirs, and families worn down by legal fees. Annie, please. She turned then, slowly. You were told not to call me that. The correction was quiet. That made it worse. Richard raised both hands, showing the room a man seeking peace. All right, Miss Whitaker, Rose. I am asking you, respectfully, not to leave like this. Like what? Angry. I'm not leaving angry. No? No. I am leaving informed. A few people looked toward the floor. The line cut too close to everyone who had enjoyed the first half of the evening. Richard took one step down from the stage area. Then let us speak as informed adults. There are ways to repair an insult. Annie looked at the suitcase in Martin's hand, then back at Richard. You keep calling it an insult because insult sounds small. It was not small. I made a mistake. You made a measurement. Richard's brow tightened. A measurement? Yes. You measured my worth by my coat, my shoes, and what you thought my life must be. You measured my family's history by the burn marks on a suitcase. You measured your own kindness at $50. She glanced toward Evelyn, and Mrs. Price is still holding the receipt. Evelyn's fingers closed around the bill. Richard's eyes flicked to the cameras. This is unnecessary. So was the kick. The hall stayed silent. Richard breathed in, then let it out through his nose. Fine. I will say it plainly. I was wrong to kick the suitcase. I was wrong to mock you. I was wrong to make assumptions. There, publicly, on camera, I said it. Annie studied him. And what changed your mind? He almost answered too quickly. He caught himself, but not enough. The documents, she said for him. Richard's mouth tightened. That is the problem, Annie continued. The drawings changed your language. The crest changed your posture. The allocation changed your tone, but none of them changed your heart. They only changed your risk. Martin Cole's eyes moved across the room, watching reactions. This was why Clara Whitaker Rose had sent Annie and not a senior partner, not a gray-haired executive, not a polished family representative with a private driver and a tailored suit. Men like Richard behaved when power introduced itself properly. The test was always how they behaved when power arrived looking like someone they thought they could dismiss. Richard lowered his voice. You do not know my heart. No, Annie said, but I have heard your mouth. Someone in the back gave a small, involuntary breath that almost became a laugh, then swallowed it. Richard turned slightly, and the room remembered to be afraid of him. Old habit came back fast. Many of them had deals with him, loans through him, boards connected to him, buildings financed by him. Shame was one thing. Self-preservation was another. He sensed the shift and used it. Let us not pretend I am the villain because I questioned an unverified item at my own event. You did not question it. You ridiculed it. Because the claim was outrageous. Only before you recognized the names. His gaze sharpened. Names matter. Then you understand why mine should have mattered before you knew it. Richard had no answer that would not hurt him. A woman near the front table spoke before she seemed to realize she had decided to. Mr. Hawthorne, perhaps you should let her go. The room turned toward her. She was in her 70s, with white hair and a navy dress, the kind of donor who had likely been on more museum boards than Richard had attended church services. Her husband touched her wrist, warning her without words. She did not take the warning. Richard stared at her. Mrs. Bellamy, I appreciate your concern. No, she said, voice trembling but clear. I don't believe you do. That was the second honest thing the room had done. Richard looked almost stunned. He had expected resistance from Annie, perhaps from Martin, not from the people who had applauded him half an hour earlier. Mrs. Bellamy looked at Annie. I laughed, she said. Annie said nothing. I shouldn't have. The apology did not fix anything, but it entered the room clean. It asked for no reward. Annie gave a small nod. Thank you, ma'am. That ma'am struck several older guests harder than anger would have. Annie had been mocked, threatened, and bought at with money, and still she remembered manners. The contrast did not flatter them. Richard saw the sympathy moving toward her and tried to step in front of it. This is becoming sentimental. Business cannot run on hurt feelings. Martin answered, no, but it can collapse from poor judgment. Richard turned on him. Are you threatening me? I'm describing gravity. Evelyn finally moved. She walked to the auction table, placed the $50 bill into a clear evidence sleeve normally used for certificates of authenticity, and wrote on a label with a black pen. Her hand shook only once. Richard watched her. What are you doing? My job, Evelyn said. You think that is wise? No, she said, capping the pen. I think it is late. Annie looked at her then with something like respect. Richard's phone buzzed again. This time the sound seemed louder because everyone knew what it meant. The world outside the hall had begun to enter. He checked it despite himself. The screen showed messages stacked over messages. One from his chief acquisition officer. Livestream clip circulating. Did you confirm Whitaker? Rose? Another from General Counsel. Stop speaking publicly. Do not touch documents. Call immediately. A third from a board member. What the hell happened at Whitmore? Richard's hand closed around the phone until his knuckles paled. Annie saw it. Your people are watching now. Richard put the phone away. My people handle noise. This is not noise. No? No. Noise fades. Evidence travels. For a moment, The only sound was a chair creaking near the back. Richard's eyes went to the suitcase again. "I will make one final proposal." Martin said, "You have made several final proposals. This one is different." Annie waited. Richard lifted his chin, choosing the room as his witness. $500 million. Full purchase. Immediate escrow. Private meeting with Clara Whitaker. Rose within 48 hours. Public apology drafted jointly. Your family controls the language. You can present it as reconciliation. The number did what numbers do. It entered people through the ribs. Even the wealthy felt it. 500 million was not an offer. It was a weather system. It changed the air. Annie stood still, and for 1 second she saw the numbers shadow. Scholarships, homes, clinics, old churches repaired, families who would never know the humiliation that had produced the money. She was not careless. She knew what wealth could do. Her family had spent generations proving that money in the right hands could build more than towers. Richard saw the pause and mistook it for surrender. "There," he said gently. "Now we are speaking responsibly." Annie looked at him. "No, now you are speaking fearfully, with a larger vocabulary." His face closed. She took the suitcase from Martin. He let her. She held it herself, burned side outward, so Richard could see the mark his shoe had left. "This is not leaving with you," she said. "Everything leaves with someone eventually." "Yes," Annie said, "but not with men who only respect what they fail to own." Richard's eyes hardened. "You are making a mistake." "Maybe," Annie said, "but it will be mine, not one I sold to you." Then she turned and continued toward the doors. No one blocked her. No one laughed. No one asked who she thought she was. At the threshold, Annie paused and looked back once. Not at Richard first, but at the room. "Remember this," she said. "A person does not become valuable the moment you discover their connections. They were valuable before you knew how to benefit from them." Then her eyes moved to Richard, and so was the suitcase. She walked out into the autumn night with the burned leather case in her hand. While behind her, Richard Hawthorne stood in a hall full of money and felt, for the first time in years, poor. The autumn air outside Whitmore Grand Hall felt colder than Annie expected. For almost a minute, she did not move beyond the stone steps. She stood under the portico with the suitcase in her hand, and the sound of the hall still trapped behind her. The murmurs, the chair legs, Richard's voice trying to rebuild itself out of money. Beyond the circular drive, black cars waited with headlights dimmed. Chauffeurs stood near open doors. A valet in a red jacket pretended not to stare. Martin Cole came out behind her, buttoning his coat. "You did well." Annie looked down at the suitcase. The scuff from Richard's shoe cut across the burned leather like a fresh insult laid over an old wound. "He kicked it," she said. "I know." He didn't even hesitate. "No," Martin said. "He didn't." Annie ran her thumb along the handle, careful not to touch the damaged side. Inside that case were papers her family had protected longer than Richard had been alive. Men had lied for less. Families had broken apart for less. Empires had been built by taking a thing like this and calling it nothing until nobody remembered who first held it. "He would have bought it," she said, "if I had named a number." Martin stood beside her, looking out toward the dark lawn. "Yes. Would that have been easier? For whom?" She almost smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "That sounds like something my grandmother would say. Your grandmother taught me most of what I know about asking the question behind the question." The valet nearest the steps looked away quickly when Annie glanced toward him. She wondered how much he had heard from the live stream. How much had already escaped the hall and reached the phones in the pockets of people who had not been invited inside. That was the strange thing about rooms built for power. They always believed the walls belonged to them, until sound found a way out. Martin's phone buzzed. He read the message and drew in a quiet breath. "What?" Annie asked. "It's spreading." "How bad?" "That depends on whom you ask. For Richard, very bad. For the truth, useful." Annie looked toward the tall windows of the hall. Through the glass, she could see figures moving inside, guests standing now, some with phones to their ears, some in tight groups, some still seated as if they had been left behind by the evening itself. "Did we plan this part?" she asked. Martin put his phone away. "Your grandmother planned for many possibilities. She did not plan for him to kick the suitcase." "No one did." "No," he said, "but Clara will not be surprised." A black town car turned into the drive and stopped near the steps. The rear window lowered halfway, and Clara Whitaker Rose's face appeared in the soft interior light. She wore a dark wrap over her shoulders and pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. Age had settled in her face without weakening it. She looked first at Annie, then at the suitcase, then at the mark Richard's shoe had left. Her mouth tightened. "Come here, child," she said. Annie walked down the steps and stopped beside the car. For the first time that night, her composure trembled. Clara noticed, but she did not reach for her immediately. She looked at the suitcase again. "He did that?" Annie nodded. "In front of everyone?" "Yes, ma'am." Clara closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the sadness in them had become something harder. A man shows his breeding by what he does when he believes nobody important is watching. He knew people were watching. Clara's voice lowered. "No, he knew cameras were watching. That is not the same thing." Martin opened the rear door. Annie got in with the suitcase on her lap. Clara sat beside her, and Martin took the front passenger seat. The driver pulled away from Whitmore Grand Hall without hurry. For a while, no one spoke. Newport passed outside the windows in pieces. Old stone walls, dark hedges, iron gates, houses with names instead of numbers. Annie had grown up knowing that wealth could look quiet when it wanted to. Her grandmother's world did not shout with neon signs or gold elevators. It hid behind trusts, portraits, foundations, letters in locked drawers, and women who served tea before telling bankers no. Clara finally said, "Tell me everything." Annie did, starting from the moment Richard clapped and offered $50. She repeated his words. The laughter, the bill, the kick, the offers climbing from millions to 500 million. She told it plainly because Clara had taught her not to decorate pain when truth was enough. When Annie finished, Clara looked out the window. Martin turned slightly from the front seat. The allocation was visible on camera. So was the crest. I closed the angle as much as I could, but enough was shown to start questions. "Good," Clara said. Annie looked at her. "Good? Questions are not the enemy. Silence is." Annie leaned back against the seat, tired all at once. "He said I dressed like that on purpose." "You did." He called it manipulation. Clara turned to her. "Did you lie?" "No." "Did you steal?" "No." "Did you ask him to be cruel?" Annie's answer came quieter. "No." "Then you did not manipulate him. You removed his script." The car slowed at a red light. Across the street, an older couple walked out of a diner. The man holding a paper bag, the woman buttoning her sweater against the cold. Ordinary people at the end of an ordinary evening. Annie watched them and felt suddenly far away from both worlds, the hall behind her and the house ahead. "What happens now?" she asked. Martin answered this time. "Richard's team will try to contain the footage. They will call it a misunderstanding. They may question authenticity. They may suggest you staged the situation unfairly." Clara added, "They will not attack you too directly at first, not while the video is fresh. Men like Richard prefer to smile, while other people sharpen knives." Annie looked down at the suitcase. "Let them." Clara placed a hand over hers. "No, do not become careless because you are right. Righteousness is not armor, it is a compass." Annie absorbed that. The car turned through the gates of the Whitaker Rose residence, a brick estate set back from the road behind old oaks. The house was lit in a few windows, not many. It did not look like the home of people who controlled a national empire. That had always been the point. Inside, the family library smelled of cedar, paper, and lemon oil. A fire burned low in the hearth. Portraits lined the walls. Men and women with steady eyes, dark suits, lace collars, work dresses, military uniforms, Sunday hats. Some had been named in public history. Most had not. Annie carried the suitcase to the long table and set it down with both hands. Clara stood before it. "Augustus carried that case out of the Baltimore office fire in 1921, she said. "His hands were burned so badly he could not hold a pen for 6 months. Men later signed documents built from his drawings while he learned to write again with bandages on." Annie looked at the case differently, though she had known the story. Tonight made it heavier. Clara touched the scuff mark Richard had made. "This will stay." Annie frowned. "We can restore it." "No," Clara said. "The old fire is history. This mark is testimony." Martin nodded slowly. "It proves sequence. Before he knew the value, he damaged it." "And after he knew?" Annie asked. Clara looked at her. "After he knew, he tried to buy the right to pretend he had not." Annie sat down in one of the leather chairs. Her anger had carried her through the hall. But now that she was home, exhaustion came in quietly. For a second, when he offered $500 million, I thought about what it could do. You should have, Clara said. Annie looked up. If you had not considered the good money can do, you would not be fit to inherit any. The question is never whether money has power. It does. The question is whose soul it asks you to hand over before it works. The room was quiet except for the fire. Martin's phone buzzed again. He checked it. Richard's office has requested an emergency call. Clara smiled without warmth. Of course they have. What should I tell them? Clara looked at Annie. This was your test to witness. You may answer. Annie stared at the suitcase, at the old burn, at the new scuff, at the lock that had opened in front of a room that thought it knew value. Then she said, "Tell them Mr. Hawthorne already made his first offer." We believed him. Martin's mouth lifted slightly. And the call? Annie looked at Clara, then back to Martin. No call tonight. Clara nodded. Martin typed the message. Annie rose and walked to the window. Outside, the trees moved in the wind, dark against the lawn. Somewhere beyond them, Richard Hawthorne was learning what it felt like to have every door still standing, yet none open to him. Behind her, Clara spoke softly. Sleep if you can, child. Tomorrow they will try to make you explain why you refused him. Annie looked at the reflection of the suitcase in the window glass. No, she said. Tomorrow he can explain why he thought $50 was enough. By morning, Richard Hawthorne's $50 had traveled farther than his apology. The first clip appeared before sunrise, cut from the auction livestream by someone who knew exactly where the wound began. It opened with Richard clapping, smiling under the chandeliers, and saying $50 was fair for a burned suitcase, because every auction needed a trash bin. Then came Annie's voice, steady enough to make the laughter sound childish. Then the bill against his tuxedo. Then his shoe striking the suitcase. Then the crest. Then the words, Orion Founding Allocation. By 8 o'clock, every business channel had found a way to say they were not passing judgment while replaying the same 10 seconds of judgment over and over. At the Whitaker Rose breakfast table, nobody turned on the television. Clara sat at the head with coffee, toast, and a folded newspaper she had not opened. Annie sat to her right, wearing a plain sweater now, her hair pulled back, the exhaustion of the night before still resting under her eyes. She had slept badly. Not because she regretted anything, but because her mind kept returning to the sound of Richard's shoe hitting the suitcase. There are sounds the body remembers before the mind allows them in. Martin Cole entered with his tablet under one arm and a folder in the other. He waited until 6:12, he said. Clara did not look up. That long? His crisis team advised silence. He ignored them. Annie reached for her coffee. What did he say? Martin set the tablet on the table and tapped the screen. Richard appeared behind a podium in a smaller room. No chandeliers this time. Only a navy backdrop and the Hawthorne Capital logo. He looked rested in the artificial way powerful men look after 3 people have worked on their face before dawn. The video began mid-sentence. Last night, an unusual item was presented at a private charity auction. In the spirit of the evening, I attempted to keep the mood light. Unfortunately, certain remarks were taken out of context, and a moment of humor became a misunderstanding. Clara made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Richard continued, I have deep respect for legacy families, entrepreneurs, and all communities who have contributed to American innovation. If Miss Whitaker Rose felt disrespected, I regret that. Annie looked at Martin. If? Martin paused the video. That was the word his lawyers fought for. Clara buttered her toast slowly. A man who says if after stepping on your foot is not apologizing. He is checking whether anyone saw the shoe. Martin resumed the clip. Richard said, We have reached out privately in hopes of resolving the matter with dignity and discretion. My commitment to philanthropy and opportunity remains unchanged. The video ended. No one spoke for a moment. Annie stirred her coffee, though she had already added nothing to it. He called it humor. He had to, Martin said. If he calls it contempt, the board asks what else he has misjudged. And Orion? Martin opened the folder. That is where the damage is growing. 3 analysts have already connected last night to his stalled acquisition attempts. 2 board members at Hawthorne Capital have requested emergency briefings. His general counsel sent another message asking whether the family will confirm authenticity publicly. Clara looked at Annie. Will we? Annie thought of the guests laughing, Richard's bill on the floor, Evelyn placing it in the evidence sleeve. Yes, she said, but not the way he wants. Martin nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Press conference? No, Annie said. Too much stage. He likes stages. Clara's eyes warmed slightly. Then what? Annie looked toward the hallway where the library waited beyond the breakfast room. Release the archive statement, the drawings, the crest, the allocation, dates, provenance, authentication, no adjectives, no outrage, just the record. Martin smiled. Facts are terrible guests for men who prefer atmosphere. Clara lifted her coffee. Send it. By noon, the Whitaker Rose Founding Trust released a 6-page statement. It did not call Richard cruel. It did not call him racist, arrogant, or dishonest. It did not need to. It laid out the history of Augustus Whitaker, the early foundation designs that became Orion, the private trust structure, the unbroken custody of the burned suitcase, and the independent verification completed before the auction. The final paragraph was the only part that felt personal. The trust will not enter acquisition, control, or strategic partnership discussions with any party that demonstrates contempt for the people, history, or stewardship attached to these holdings. At 12:07, Martin read the paragraph aloud in Clara's library. Annie stood near the suitcase, which now rested on a linen-covered table beneath a shaded lamp. The new scuff mark remained visible. Clara had forbidden restoration. Annie understood why, though part of her still wanted the damage undone. Martin's phone began buzzing almost as soon as the statement went live. One from Richard's office, he said. One from Hawthorne General Counsel. 2 from Business Press. 1 from Senator Vale's staff. 3 from Orion board observers. Clara leaned back in her chair. Let them wait. Annie looked at her. All of them? The polite ones may wait politely. The rude ones may wait rudely. That made Annie smile for the first time that morning. The smile did not last. Her own phone, which she had left face down on the desk, began vibrating. She turned it over and saw a message from an unknown number. Then another. Then a screenshot sent by a school friend she had not spoken to in months. The comments under the clip had split the way public comments always split. Some praising her composure, some accusing her of setting a trap. Some asking why a girl from a powerful family dressed poor, some saying Richard only joked, some saying people were too sensitive, some saying they had been in rooms like that and knew exactly what they had heard. Annie read one line twice. If she was really rich, then she was the bully. She set the phone down. Clara noticed. What did you find? People think I tricked him. Some do. Did I? Clara did not answer quickly. That was one of the things Annie trusted about her. Clara never rushed into comfort just because comfort was wanted. You wore old clothes, Clara said. You carried real history. You stated the real price. You asked to be heard. He chose ridicule, then pity, then force, then money. Which of those choices did you make for him? None. Then do not adopt his behavior as your burden. Annie sat on the edge of the desk. But if I had come as myself, none of this would have happened. No, Clara said. Something worse would have happened. He would have behaved. Annie looked at her. Clara's voice softened. A man behaving because he recognizes power is not the same as a man showing respect. Your grandfather used to say good manners toward a judge do not prove kindness toward a janitor. Martin glanced up from his phone. Hawthorne just released a second statement. Clara sighed. That was fast. Martin read it aloud. Mr. Hawthorne has great admiration for the Whitaker Rose family and has always sought constructive dialogue regarding Orion's future. He regrets that a private matter was presented in a confrontational manner at a charitable event and remains hopeful that cooler heads will prevail. Annie gave a small, bitter laugh. Cooler heads. He's trying to make you look emotional. Martin said. I barely raised my voice. That is why he needs to suggest you did. Clara stood amoored to the suitcase. She rested one hand near the lock, not on the scuff. Now he will offer concern, then doubt, then pressure through friends. Then he will find someone willing to say the documents should be in a museum, not in family hands. After that, if he grows desperate, he will speak of shareholders. Annie looked at Martin. Can he challenge the trust? He can try. He will lose, but trying can still make noise. Evidence travels, Annie said quietly. Martin nodded. So does money. The room fell silent. That afternoon, the first call came from someone Richard thought Clara might listen to. An old banking friend named Henry Bell, who spoke in the careful tone of a man carrying another man's message with gloves on. Clara put him on speaker. Clara, Henry said. I hope you know I call as a friend. Then speak as one. A pause. Richard handled himself poorly. No question. But closing a door forever, over one ugly evening, may not serve the broader good. Clara's eyes moved to Annie. Henry, when you were a boy, did your father ever tell you not to pick up pennies in front of men who throw them? Henry exhaled. Clara, mine did. He said sometimes the money is not payment, sometimes it is instruction. I'm only saying there may be a path to reconciliation. There is, Clara said. Richard can become a better man without owning what my family built. The call ended soon after. By evening, Richard Hawthorne had not reached Clara, had not softened Annie, and had not slowed the spread of the clip. But he had managed one thing. He had reminded the Whitaker Rose family that men who cannot buy a door often begin looking for windows. Martin stayed late in the library. Annie found him near the long table, reviewing a list of possible legal filings. You think he'll come after the suitcase? She asked. Not directly. That means yes. Martin closed the folder. It means he will come after the idea that your family should be allowed to keep it. Annie looked at the burned case. Yesterday, it had been a test. Now it was a target. Clara entered quietly behind them. Then we move first. Martin turned. Public exhibit? Clara nodded. The suitcase comes out of hiding. The drawings, too, in controlled form. Let the country see what he called trash. Annie looked from her grandmother to the suitcase. And the title? Clara's face softened, but her voice stayed firm. The things they called worthless. Annie touched the handle, feeling the old leather beneath her fingers. For the first time since Richard kicked it, she did not want to hide the mark. She wanted people to see exactly where his shoe had landed. The decision to exhibit the suitcase changed the nature of the fight. As long as the documents remained inside the Whitaker Rose library, Richard Hawthorne could call them private, inconvenient, theatrical, mishandled. He could send lawyers to argue about chain of custody and spokesmen to whisper about youthful provocation. But once the suitcase entered public view under controlled authentication, every burn mark, every seal, every line drawn by Augustus Whitaker became harder to talk around. By 9 the next morning, Martin Cole had 3 museum consultants on the phone, 2 archival insurers reviewing transport requirements, and 1 security firm asking whether the family expected protests. Clara answered that one herself. We expect interest, she said. Prepare for behavior. Annie sat across the library table with a legal pad in front of her. She had written the exhibition title at the top, The Things They Called Worthless. Under it, she had listed what would be shown and what would remain sealed. The suitcase would be displayed with the scuff visible. The crest would be shown behind glass. Selected drawings would be reproduced in high resolution, while the originals would appear only during the opening under archival conditions. The founding allocation would be displayed in redacted form, enough to prove its nature without handing Richard's attorneys a map. Martin approved of that. Let them see the door without giving them the hinges. Clara nodded. Good. Annie looked up from the pad. Where do we hold it? Martin named 3 possibilities. A private gallery in Providence, a university archive in Boston, a museum in New York that owed Clara a favor and would pretend it did not. Clara rejected them all. Too grand. Too far away. Too much marble. Martin leaned back. Then where? Annie already knew. Baltimore. Clara looked at her. The office fire was there. Annie said. Augustus carried the suitcase out of Baltimore. If people are going to see what survived, they should see it where the story almost ended. For a moment, Clara said nothing. Then she closed her eyes briefly, and Annie understood she had touched a memory older than herself. Yes, Clara said. Baltimore. Martin made a note. We can contact the Douglas Street Civic Archive. Smaller venue. Respected. Strong community board. Good climate control after the renovation. Clara's expression softened. Augustus gave his first public lecture 2 blocks from there. Then it's settled, Annie said. It felt good for half a second, the clean feeling of a decision made for the right reason. Then Martin's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Hawthorne General Counsel. Clara reached for her coffee. Let him speak. Martin answered on speaker. This is Cole. A man's voice came through, polished and tired. Martin, it's Daniel Voss. I assume Mrs. Whitaker. Rose is present. She is. And Miss Whitaker, Rose? Annie said. I'm here. A pause. Good. Then I'll be direct. Mr. Hawthorne is prepared to issue a fuller apology and withdraw all prior acquisition overtures for a cooling-off period, provided the family refrains from further public escalation. Clara smiled faintly. Public escalation? Is that what you call a historical exhibit now? Daniel Voss exhaled. Clara, with respect, an exhibit built around last night's incident will inflame matters. It is built around a suitcase. A suitcase Mr. Hawthorne regrets mishandling. Annie looked at the scuff mark. Mishandling is when you drop something by accident. The lawyer did not answer her directly. Miss Whitaker, Rose, nobody benefits from turning one unfortunate moment into a national spectacle. Mr. Voss, Annie said, your client made it a spectacle when he laughed into a microphone. Another pause. Daniel shifted tone. The concern is that public display of founding materials could affect market stability around Orion and related entities. There are shareholder implications. Martin's eyes lifted. There it was. The children were gone, the apology had thinned, and now came shareholders. Clara set down her cup. Daniel, I have heard men use markets the way children use blankets. They pull them over whatever they are afraid to look at. Clara, I'm not here to threaten. No, you are here to warn politely on behalf of a man who has run out of charm. Daniel's voice cooled. If the exhibit suggests Mr. Hawthorne's actions influenced trust decisions regarding acquisition discussions, we will need to review potential claims of reputational harm. Martin leaned toward the phone. Be careful. Daniel was silent. Martin continued. Your client is on video offering $50, kicking a protected historical object, increasing his offer to hundreds of millions after recognizing its connection to Orion and requesting private access to the family. If you want discovery on reputational harm, we will enjoy producing the full record. Annie had never heard Martin sound angry before. He did not raise his voice. That made it sharper. Daniel said, I'll relay your position. Relay this too. Clara said. The exhibit opens in Baltimore. Now Daniel's silence changed. Baltimore? Yes. Mrs. Whitaker. Rose, I strongly recommend. No, Daniel. You strongly prefer. There is a difference. She ended the call. For several seconds, the room held the aftertaste of polite threat. Annie tapped her pen once against the legal pad. He's afraid of Baltimore. Martin nodded. Because Baltimore makes it about Augustus, not Richard. Clara looked toward the portraits on the wall. And because men like Richard can survive being called rude, they have difficulty surviving evidence that they were late to history. By late afternoon, the exhibit announcement went out. The Douglas Street Civic Archive will host The Things They Called Worthless, a public exhibition of selected Whitaker Rose founding materials connected to the origins of Orion Group, including the surviving Baltimore fire suitcase carried by Augustus Whitaker in 1921. The exhibit will examine preservation, authorship, stewardship, and the histories often dismissed before they are understood. No mention of Richard Hawthorne appeared in the announcement. That made it worse for him. Everyone knew anyway. The first call to the archive came from a local school teacher asking whether seniors from her community history class could attend. The second came from a retired engineer who said his grandfather had worked on early utility surveys in Baltimore and had always claimed a black draftsman was the smartest man in the office. The third came from a woman in her 80s who asked whether the Whitaker in the exhibit was related to Mr. Gus, who drew buildings nobody let him sign. When the archive director told Martin that story, Clara turned away from the room. Annie followed her into the hallway. Grandmother? Clara stood near a window overlooking the garden. Her hands rested on the sill. My father called him Mr. Gus when he was small. The woman remembered him. Yes, Clara said. People remember more than official records give them permission to. Annie stood beside her. Then the exhibit is right. It is right, Clara said. That does not make it easy. The next morning, Richard made his move. Not through Daniel Voss. Not through a statement. He went on a national business program and sat across from a host who smiled as if uncomfortable questions were a form of bad manners. Richard looked directly into the camera. I deeply regret my words at the auction, but I must say, there is a larger issue here. Critical documents connected to one of America's most important companies should not be used as props in a personal dispute. They belong in responsible institutional hands. Annie watched from the library with Clara and Martin. The host asked, Are you suggesting the Whitaker Rose family is not a responsible steward? Richard paused with practiced sorrow. I'm suggesting history belongs to the public. Martin muttered, says the man who offered $500 million to take it private. Clara's face did not change. Richard continued, this should not be about race, or class, or hurt feelings. This should be about preserving American innovation. Annie turned off the screen. Martin looked at her. You all right? No, she said. But I'm clear. Clara nodded once. Good. Clarity lasts longer than comfort. Annie picked up the phone on the desk and called the Douglas Street Civic Archive herself. The director answered on the second ring. This is Annie Whitaker. Rose, she said. I want the exhibit opening to include community testimony. Not just our documents. People who remember the old stories, families who heard about Augustus, workers whose names were left out. If Richard wants to say history belongs to the public, then let the public speak. The director was quiet for a moment. Miss Whitaker. Rose. That may become a very emotional evening. It should. After she hung up, Clara looked at her for a long time. What? Annie asked. Clara's eyes were bright, though her voice stayed steady. Now you understand the suitcase. Annie looked toward the burned case on the table. At first, she had thought it carried proof. Then she thought it carried power. Now she understood it carried invitation. Not to Richard. Never to Richard. To everyone who had been told their stories were too small, too damaged, too inconvenient, or too late to matter. That evening, as preparations began for Baltimore, Richard's office sent one final message through Daniel Voss. Mr. Hawthorne remains open to reconciliation. Clara read it, handed the phone to Annie, and waited. Annie typed the reply herself. Reconciliation requires respect. Mr. Hawthorne offered his first valuation publicly. We accepted it as evidence, not payment. She sent it before she could overthink it. Then she walked to the suitcase and rested her hand on the scuffed side. The mark was still ugly. It still hurt to see, but now it had work to do. The week before the Baltimore opening, Richard Hawthorne stopped apologizing. That was how Clara knew he had chosen war. His statements changed shape first. The word regret disappeared. Then misunderstanding disappeared. By Tuesday morning, his people were no longer speaking about a charity auction gone wrong. They were speaking about market stability, responsible stewardship, and the danger of private families controlling historically significant corporate materials. By Wednesday, one of his friendly columnists wrote that the Whitaker-Rose family was weaponizing identity and inherited secrecy against American enterprise. By Thursday, a former regulator on television wondered aloud whether the Orion founding documents should be reviewed by federal authorities for the public good. Annie read that line twice in the library and set the tablet down. For the public good, she said. Clara, seated near the window with a stack of old correspondence, did not look surprised. That phrase has stolen many things. Martin Cole stood at the long table, checking the transport inventory for the third time. He is trying to make ownership look suspicious. Because he couldn't buy it, Annie said. Because he couldn't buy it publicly after insulting you, Martin corrected. That is the part he cannot survive. If he had discovered the suitcase in private, he would have offered less and smiled more. The suitcase sat in its climate-controlled travel case now, the burned leather visible beneath the clear archival lid. The scuff mark from Richard's shoe remained uncovered. The conservator had wanted to stabilize the surface around it, but Clara had insisted the mark be preserved exactly as it was. Damage has dates, Clara had said. Let this one keep its own. On Friday morning, the first legal letter arrived. It was not a lawsuit. Richard was too careful for that. At least at first. It was a request for preservation, inspection, and temporary suspension of public exhibition pending neutral review of the material's implications for Orion shareholders. Martin read the letter aloud without emotion. Annie listened from the window, arms crossed. When he finished, she asked, "Can he stop the exhibit?" "No," Martin said. "He can annoy it. He can frighten vendors. He can make insurers nervous. He can make the archive worry about costs. He can create enough smoke that people start asking whether there must be fire." Clara looked up. "Then we show them where the fire was. By noon," Martin sent the response. It was short, formal, and cold enough to leave no fingerprints. The family rejected any suspension. The materials had been authenticated. The exhibit would proceed. Any attempt to interfere with transport, insurance, venue access, or public programming would be treated as tortious interference and answered in court. Annie read the last sentence and looked at Martin. You sound nicer in person. I charge extra for warmth. Clara smiled into her tea. The joke helped, but only for a moment. That afternoon, the Douglas Street Civic Archive called. The director, Marlene Carter, sounded embarrassed and angry, in equal measure. Miss Whitaker, Rose, I wanted you to hear it from me. 2 of our sponsors received calls this morning. Not threats exactly. Clara, Martin, and Annie exchanged glances. What kind of calls? Annie asked. The kind where a man says he's only asking questions, but every question has a brick in it. Martin took the phone. Names? Marlene gave him 2. A regional bank. A construction foundation. Did they withdraw? No, Marlene said. The bank wavered. The foundation doubled its check. Annie let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Marlene's voice softened. People here know this pattern. Miss Whitaker. Rose. We may not have your family's money, but we know what it means when somebody powerful suddenly gets concerned about process. Clara leaned toward the phone. Mrs. Carter, can you still open safely? Yes, ma'am. But I want to be honest. The crowd will be larger than we planned. Since your announcement about community testimony, we've had calls from church groups, retired engineers, school alumni associations, neighborhood elders, even a union local whose members say their grandparents worked sites tied to early Orion projects. Annie's chest tightened. They're coming? They're coming with stories. After the call ended, Clara sat quietly for a long time. Annie said, he wanted the public. Now the public is showing up. Yes, Clara said, and that is when men like Richard remember they only meant a certain kind of public. The transport left before dawn Saturday. There were no sirens, no dramatic convoy. Just 2 archival vehicles, a security car, Martin in the lead sedan, and Annie riding with Clara behind the truck that carried the suitcase. The roads out of Newport were gray in the early light. Coffee steamed in paper cups. The driver kept the radio low, an old soul station Clara liked, where the songs sounded as if they had survived something and chosen melody anyway. Annie watched the rear doors of the transport truck. Do you think Augustus would have wanted this? Clara did not answer at once. Augustus wanted credit for his work. He also wanted his family safe. Those wishes did not always fit in the same room. What would he choose now? Clara looked at the road ahead. I think he would ask whether the children know his name yet. Annie thought of the retired woman who remembered Mr. Gus. She thought of the school teacher bringing seniors. She thought of Richard saying history belonged to the public, as if he had not tried to buy it into silence. Then we tell them, she said. Baltimore greeted them with brick row houses, church steeples, corner stores, murals, and streets that seemed to carry memory in their seams. The Douglas Street Civic Archive stood in a restored building that had once been a black newspaper office, then a union hall, then nearly nothing until the neighborhood saved it. Its front steps were swept clean. Folding chairs had been set in the small auditorium. In the lobby, volunteers arranged programs beside a coffee urn and trays of pound cake, butter cookies, and small ham biscuits, brought by a church auxiliary that refused payment. Marlene Carter met them at the entrance. She was in her 60s, with close-cropped gray hair and a voice that had learned to be pleasant without surrendering authority. Mrs. Whitaker, Rose, she said, taking Clara's hand. Welcome home, in a manner of speaking. Clara's eyes softened. Thank you, Marlene turned to Annie. And you must be the young woman who made a billionaire forget his manners. Annie almost laughed. He had already forgotten them. Fair enough. Inside, the exhibit team worked with quiet concentration. The suitcase was placed in a glass case at the center of the first room, not elevated too high, not hidden behind theatrical lighting. It sat at eye level. Burn marks, bent lock, old handle, new scuff. Beside it, the label read, Burned leather fire case carried by Augustus Whitaker after the Baltimore office fire. 1,921. Preserved by the Whitaker, Rose Founding Trust. Publicly dismissed as worthless at a Newport auction, 2020s. Annie read the last line twice. Publicly dismissed as worthless. Marlene stood beside her. Too much? No, Annie said. Accurate. Martin came in from the front desk, his face alert. We may have a problem. Clara turned. What kind? Richard is coming. Marlene's eyebrows rose. Here? His office just notified press he will attend the exhibit opening in a spirit of reconciliation and respect for history. Annie stared at him. He can't be serious. Martin said, he is very serious when cameras are nearby. Clara looked toward the suitcase, then toward the front doors, where the first guests were already gathering outside. Marlene folded her arms. This is a public exhibit. If he comes peacefully, we cannot bar him without handing him a headline. He wants a photograph beside the suitcase, Annie said. He wants to stand next to what he called trash and smile until people forget the kick. Clara's face was calm, but her eyes were hard. Then we do not let him stand alone with it. The doors opened at noon. People entered slowly at first, then in a steady stream. Older men in flat caps. Women from church groups wearing Sunday coats though it was Saturday. College students with notebooks. Retired engineers. Local reporters. A man who said his grandfather had poured concrete on one of the early sites and never received his final pay. A grandmother who brought her granddaughter because, as she told Annie, baby needs to see that paper can have a backbone. Annie stayed near the suitcase, not as a guard, but as a witness. Then the room shifted. Cameras at the entrance turned, voices lowered. Richard Hawthorne walked in wearing a dark suit. No tuxedo now. No mocking smile. Daniel Voss came beside him. 2 aides followed, and behind them came reporters hungry for the picture he wanted to give them. Richard approached slowly, hands visible, face arranged into humility. Miss Whitaker, Rose, he said. Mrs. Whitaker, Rose, I came to pay my respects. Before Clara could answer, an elderly man near the display case spoke from his folding chair. Respect is quieter when it's real. The room went still. Richard turned toward him, startled. The man was thin, brown-skinned, with a cane resting across his knees and a program folded in one hand. Marlene stepped forward. Mr. Hawthorne, this is Mr. Leonard Price. His father worked in the Baltimore drafting office after the fire. Leonard Price looked at Richard without rising. My father said Mr. Gus Whitaker could draw a foundation so clean you could hear the building stand up. Said men took his sheets and forgot his name before lunch. Richard's face held its public softness, but the room had changed against him. Leonard tapped his cane once on the floor. You came for respect, sir? Then sit down and listen. No one spoke. For once, Richard Hawthorne did not have the microphone. Richard Hawthorne remained standing for 1 second too long. It was not much, but everyone in the room felt it. Mr. Leonard Price had not raised his voice. He had not accused Richard of anything. He had simply told him to sit down and listen, and in a room filled with people whose families had been ignored by men with better suits, that sounded like an order older than money. Richard looked toward the reporters. Their cameras were lifted. If he refused, the clip would be everywhere by dinner. If he obeyed, he would look small. For a man who had come to borrow humility for a photograph, the choice had arrived sooner than expected. He gave a slow nod. Of course. A volunteer brought a folding chair. Richard sat in the second row, not the front, because the front was already filled with elders from the neighborhood. Daniel Voss sat beside him, stiff-faced, one hand over his phone, as if he could hold back the entire internet with his palm. Annie stood near the display case, close enough to see Richard's eyes move to the suitcase. He had come to stand beside it. Instead, he was seated below it, like everyone else. Marlene Carter walked to the front of the room. We planned today as an exhibit opening, she said. But history has a way of asking for witnesses before it asks for speeches. So we're going to begin with the people who remember what paper forgot. There was no applause, only attention. Leonard Price pushed himself up with his cane before anyone could offer help. His daughter, a woman in her 50s with silver at her temples, moved 1 step toward him. He shook his head, not unkindly. I'm all right, Janie. He stood facing the room, thin but steady. My father's name was Thomas Price, he began. He was a draftsman's assistant in the old Baltimore office after the fire. He swept floors, sharpened pencils, carried tubes of drawings, made coffee for men who called him boy when he had a wife and 2 children at home. A few older people nodded. They knew that kind of sentence because their own families had carried versions of it. He used to talk about Mr. Augustus Whitaker, called him Mr. Gus, said Mr. Gus could look at a bare piece of land and see where the water needed to run, where the load would settle, where the sun would hit brick at 4 in the afternoon. My father said other men came in with titles. Mr. Gus came in with answers. Annie looked at Clara. Her grandmother's face was still, but her fingers had closed around the handle of her purse. Leonard continued. After the fire, my father said Mr. Gus came back with both hands wrapped up. Burned bad. Couldn't hold a pen right, but he sat at a desk anyway, and told my father where to place the ruler. My father drew lines for him, said he was scared to breathe because Mr. Gus would say, "No, son, not there." A building has to tell the truth to the ground first. A sound moved through the room, soft and human. Annie had heard that sentence in family stories, but never from outside the family. A building has to tell the truth to the ground first. Augustus had said it. Someone else had remembered it. That made him less like a portrait and more like a man who had once stood in a room and corrected a young assistant with bandaged hands. Leonard turned toward the suitcase. My father said Mr. Gus kept a burned case by his desk. Said it looked ugly. Said some men joked about it. But when those men needed the early drawings, they asked him for what was inside. His eyes moved to Richard. Funny how that works. Richard's face did not change, but Daniel Voss shifted beside him. Leonard sat down slowly. This time he allowed his daughter to touch his elbow. Marlene thanked him and called the next witness, Mrs. Althea Freeman, a retired school principal from East Baltimore. She came forward wearing a navy church hat and carried a folder so worn at the corners it looked like it had been opened by 3 generations. My mother cleaned offices in that building, she said. She couldn't tell you what the documents meant, but she knew who people trusted. She said if a white executive wanted the job to look impressive, he called one of his own. If he wanted the job done right, he found Mr. Whitaker. A few people murmured, "That's right." Mrs. Freeman opened her folder and removed a small photograph. This was my mother's. That's her on the left. That's Mr. Whitaker in the middle. My mother wrote on the back, "The man who knew the bones of buildings." Marlene took the photograph carefully and placed it under the document camera. The image appeared on a screen. A younger Augustus Whitaker standing outside a brick office, hat in hand. Face serious. With 2 women in work dresses beside him. The room leaned in. Annie felt something in her chest loosen and ache at the same time. Richard looked at the screen, then at the reporters, calculating whether looking moved would help or hurt him. Annie saw the calculation and looked away. Some people could not even receive grace without pricing it. The testimonies continued. A retired union man spoke about old site crews who said the earliest Orion utility routes had followed Whitaker's grid long after his name disappeared from official presentations. A woman brought a church bulletin from the 1950s that listed Clara's father giving a lecture on black engineers and hidden authorship. A former city clerk remembered sealed trust references that younger staff were told not to ask about. None of it alone would have shaken a corporation. Together, the pieces made a sound like boards being pulled off a boarded window. By the time Marlene invited Annie to speak, she had stopped feeling like the exhibit belonged only to her family. The suitcase had opened something wider. Annie walked to the front without notes. She stood beside the display case. Through the glass, the burned leather rested under soft light, and Richard's scuff mark remained visible on one side. My grandmother told me once that paper remembers what people try to forget, Annie said. I believed her, but I think I only understood half of it. Paper remembers names, dates, signatures, ownership, but people remember breath. They remember how a man stood, how he spoke, how he treated the young man sharpening pencils beside him. She looked at Leonard Price. Thank you for giving Augustus breath today. Leonard lowered his head. Annie turned toward the room. Last week, this suitcase was called trash because it looked damaged. I was treated as if I had no right to know its value, because I did not look the way power is expected to look. That is not new. Many families in this room know what it means to carry something true while someone else decides you are not dressed properly for truth. Richard stared straight ahead. Annie did not look at him yet. The lesson of this suitcase is not that my family is powerful. Power is not rare in America. The lesson is that contempt is often fastest when it thinks there will be no consequence. And respect that only arrives after a surname is not respect. It is strategy. Several people nodded. Mrs. Freeman whispered, "Amen," under her breath. Annie finally looked at Richard. Mr. Hawthorne came here today to pay respect. So I will say this plainly. Respect cannot stand beside the suitcase for a photograph. It has to sit down and listen to the people who were ignored before the cameras arrived. The room held its breath. Richard's face tightened. He knew every camera was waiting for his response. He stood slowly. "May I speak?" he asked. Marlene looked at Clara. Clara looked at Annie. Annie said, briefly, that word cost Richard something. He stepped into the aisle but did not approach the display. "I came today because I regret what happened at Whitmore. I regret my words, and I regret my actions toward the suitcase. Annie heard it. Toward the suitcase. Not toward her. Not toward the people who laughed. Not toward the history he tried to buy once he recognized it. Leonard Price leaned on his cane. What about the girl? Richard turned. Leonard's voice was calm. You regretted your actions toward the suitcase. What about the girl carrying it? The room became completely still. Richard looked at Annie. His public face searched for the right sentence. For once, none arrived smoothly. I regret, he said, that Miss Whitaker, Rose, felt disrespected. Mrs. Freeman made a small sound. Felt? Annie did not rescue him. Richard swallowed. I regret that I disrespected Miss Whitaker. Rose? Leonard was not finished. Before or after you knew her name? Daniel Voss closed his eyes. Richard's jaw tightened. Before. The word came out rough. Leonard nodded once and sat back. All right then. That's a start. Not a finish. A few people murmured agreement. Richard looked smaller standing there than he had in the auction hall. Not ruined. Not reformed. Just seen. Annie stepped back toward the suitcase. That is all today needs from you, Mr. Hawthorne. He looked as if he wanted to object, but there was no ground beneath it. He returned to his chair. The community testimony resumed after that, and Richard had to sit through every word. No microphone. No offer. No number. Just stories from people whose names had never troubled his spreadsheets. Near the end of the afternoon, a little girl with braids stood beside her grandmother in front of the glass case and pointed to the scuff mark. Grandma, why didn't they fix that part? The grandmother looked at Annie, then at the suitcase. So folks remember, she said. Annie heard her and looked across the room at Richard Hawthorne. He heard it too. By the time the Baltimore exhibit closed for the day, Richard Hawthorne had learned the difference between attention and witness. Attention was what he was used to. Attention turned toward him when he entered a room. It waited for his opinion, laughed when he joked, and leaned forward when he named a number. Witness was different. Witness did not flatter. It remembered. It held the pieces in order and refused to let a powerful man rearrange them. He left through the side entrance with Daniel Voss beside him, but not before the cameras caught his face. There was no smile this time. No practiced warmth. No hand over the heart. Just a man walking away from a room where money had not been the loudest thing. Inside, Annie helped Marlene Carter gather the testimony forms from the folding chairs. She did not need to help. Volunteers were already moving through the room with clipboards and coffee cups, folding programs, stacking unused napkins, guiding elders toward the exit, but Annie wanted to touch the ordinary work of the place. After a week of statements, lawyers, offers, and headlines, there was comfort in picking up paper from chairs. Mrs. Freeman came by with her worn folder tucked under one arm. You did well today, she said. Thank you, ma'am. The older woman studied her. Not because you spoke perfectly. Folks put too much weight on perfect. You did well because you let other people speak too. Annie nodded, and the words stayed with her. Leonard Price was near the door, buttoning his coat while his daughter fussed with his scarf. He caught Annie's eye and motioned her over with 2 fingers. Young lady, he said, don't let that man make this whole thing about him. I'm trying not to. Try harder. His daughter sighed. Daddy. No, Janie, I mean it. Leonard looked back at Annie. Men like that will even make their shame expensive. Next thing you know, everybody's talking about his apology, his growth, his reputation, his losses. That suitcase isn't about him. Don't let him rent space in your grandfather's house. Annie smiled faintly. Great-grandfather. At my age, everybody is somebody's grandfather. He tapped his cane once. You know what I mean. I do. Good. Then remember it. After he left, Annie stood for a moment beside the glass case. The suitcase looked different in Baltimore. At Whitmore, it had seemed out of place, an ugly thing on polished wood beneath chandeliers. Here, surrounded by photographs, letters, maps, and voices that had been waiting decades for permission to enter the record, it looked like it had finally been set down where it could breathe. Clara came to stand beside her. Leonard gave you instructions. He did. Were they good? Yes. Then take them. Annie looked toward the side door Richard had used. He's going to try again. Of course. I thought today might stop him. Clara's mouth curved without humor. Today did stop him. That is why he will try again in a different direction. Martin Cole joined them with his phone in hand. He already has. Annie turned. What now? Martin read from the screen. Hawthorne Capital has issued a statement affirming Mr. Hawthorne's respect for community history and announcing a proposed $200 million initiative to support preservation of underrepresented innovators in American business. Clara closed her eyes. There it is. Annie felt her stomach drop. He's trying to buy the subject. Yes, Martin said, and name himself its guardian. Marlene Carter, who had come close enough to hear, gave a short laugh. That man moves fast when he's scared. Annie looked at the suitcase. Can he do that? Legally? Yes, Martin said. Morally? That depends on whether people let him. Clara turned to Annie. This is the next lesson. When a man cannot own the thing, he may try to own the language around it. Richard's announcement spread before dinner. By evening, business commentators were already debating whether his new preservation initiative showed accountability. Some said it was a generous response to criticism. Others called it reputation laundering. A few avoided the hard part entirely and praised the size of the number. $200 million had a way of making shallow people sound thoughtful. Back at the small hotel near the archive, Annie sat on the edge of the bed with room service untouched on the desk. Tomato soup, grilled cheese, a slice of apple pie Clara had ordered because she believed bad days required familiar food. The television was off, but Annie's phone kept lighting up. Headlines, clips, arguments. Richard Hawthorne announces historic equity preservation fund. Hawthorne turns controversy into commitment. Whitaker Rose family. Yet to respond. Clara sat in the chair by the window, removing her earrings. Eat something. I'm not hungry. Eat anyway. Men who want your attention should not be allowed to ruin your supper. Annie picked up half the sandwich and took a bite she did not taste. Martin knocked once and entered with a folder. I can draft a response tonight. Annie swallowed. What would it say? That the family welcomes all sincere efforts to preserve overlooked histories, but rejects any attempt to use philanthropy to distract from documented conduct. Clara looked at Annie. That is a good lawyer's sentence. It sounds like one, Annie said. Martin shrugged. I am guilty of my profession. Annie set the sandwich down. It won't be enough. He wants to turn this into a contest of who gives more. If we answer with a statement, he'll answer with a bigger number. Clara watched her carefully. Then what do you propose? Annie did not answer right away. She walked to the window. Baltimore lights stretched beyond the glass. Ordinary and uneven. Somewhere out there, Leonard Price was probably home with his daughter. Mrs. Freeman had likely placed her folder back on a shelf. The little girl who asked about the scuff mark might be telling someone what her grandmother said. So folks remember, Annie turned from the window, we don't compete with his fund. We make ours smaller and harder to fake. Martin lifted an eyebrow. Smaller? Yes. Not a national announcement. Not his kind of stage. We start with the archive. Oral histories, family documents, restoration grants for local records, training for students to preserve papers in their own communities. People can bring church minutes, photographs, land deeds, letters, business records. We help them protect what their families carried. Clara's face changed slowly, as if Annie had opened a door in a house Clara thought she knew. Annie continued, call it the Augustus Whitaker Stewardship Program. Not because we're trying to beat Richard's number, because Leonard was right. This isn't about him. Martin wrote quickly. Initial amount? Annie looked at Clara. Clara smiled. You tell me. 10 million, Annie said. Endowed through the archive and partner institutions. Public reporting. Community board. No family naming rights beyond the program. Martin looked pleased. That will make Richard's 200 million look very shiny and very far away. That's not why, Annie said. I know. That is why it will work. Clara stood and crossed the room to Annie. Your great-grandfather would like that. Annie's throat tightened. Would he? He carried drawings out of a fire. You are helping other people carry theirs before the fire comes. The next morning, the announcement was made not from a ballroom, not from a corporate podium, but from the reading room of the Douglas Street Civic Archive. Marlene stood at the center, with Annie, Clara, Martin, Leonard Price, Mrs. Freeman, and several community board members behind her. Marlene spoke first. This program will preserve family records, neighborhood histories, church papers, worker documents, photographs, and private collections that too often disappear before institutions decide they are important. Then Annie stepped forward. She kept her remarks short. Last week, a suitcase was called worthless because someone judged the outside before understanding what it carried. But families across this country have boxes, drawers, trunks, envelopes, and Bibles filled with proof of who they were and what they built. We do not want those things valued only after powerful people find a use for them. We want them protected because they mattered all along. A reporter asked whether this was a response to Richard Hawthorne's new fund. Annie looked at Leonard, then at the suitcase behind glass. No, she said. It is a response to everyone who was told their history was too small to save. That answer led every evening broadcast. Richard's $200 million initiative still made news, but now it looked different. Large, yes. Polished, yes. But somehow hollow beside elders bringing folders to a neighborhood archive and a young woman explaining that preservation did not have to wait for permission from wealth. That afternoon, Daniel Voss called Martin again. Martin put it on speaker because Clara asked him to. Daniel sounded tired. Richard wants to meet. Clara said, he has met the suitcase. That should be enough. He wants to meet privately with Miss Whitaker. Rose. Annie answered, why? To apologize without cameras. She looked at Clara. Clara gave nothing away. Annie said, he had that chance before the cameras mattered to him. Daniel paused. He says he understands that. No, Annie said. He understands losing. That is not the same thing. Daniel exhaled. What should I tell him? Annie looked toward the reading room, where volunteers were already helping an older man scan photographs from a shoebox. Tell him to write down the apology, she said. Not for me. For himself. Then tell him to read it in a room where nobody can benefit him. If it still sounds true there, maybe he'll have learned something. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I'll relay that. After the call ended, Clara looked at Annie with pride she did not try to hide. You are becoming difficult to buy, she said. Annie smiled. Good. No, Clara said. Necessary. Outside the archive, the line of visitors stretched down the block. Some came to see the suitcase. Some came with envelopes, photographs, deeds, and stories. Some came because they had seen a billionaire sit down and listen when an old man told him to. But most came because something damaged had been placed behind glass without being repaired, and the label did not apologize for the scars. By evening, Annie stood beside the display case again. The scuff mark was still there. It no longer looked like the end of something. It looked like the place where the record began to speak louder. The first letter arrived 3 days after the Augustus Whitaker Stewardship Program opened its intake desk. It came in a cream envelope, hand-delivered to the Douglas Street Civic Archive by a courier who asked for Annie by name, and left before anyone could ask who sent him. Martin examined the envelope before letting her touch it. No return address. Heavy paper. Richard's kind of quiet. Annie stood in Marlene Carter's office with Clara seated by the window and Martin near the door. Outside, the reading room was full again. Volunteers helped an elderly woman label photographs from a funeral home that had served black families for 60 years. A retired dock worker was telling a student how his mother kept rent receipts in a biscuit tin because she did not trust landlords who smiled too easily. The archive smelled of paper, coffee, dust, and pound cake from someone's church kitchen. Martin slit the envelope open with a letter knife and unfolded 2 pages. From Richard? Annie asked. Yes. Clara looked at Martin. Read it. Martin adjusted his glasses, but Annie stopped him. No, she said. I'll read it. He handed her the pages. Richard's handwriting was controlled, narrow, and almost too neat. It did not look like the hand of a man who had kicked a suitcase. That unsettled her more than she expected. Cruelty rarely announces itself in ugly script. Miss Whitaker rose. The letter began. Not Annie. Not young lady. Not sweetheart. That was something. She read silently at first, then aloud because Clara had taught her that some words needed air before they could be trusted. I have written this letter several times and destroyed each version because every draft sounded like a man trying to manage consequences rather than face them. You were correct about that. I have spent much of my life confusing repair with control. Annie paused. Martin's expression did not change. Clara's did not either, but her fingers rested still on the arm of the chair. Annie continued. At Whitmore Grand Hall, I did not merely misjudge an object. I misjudged you. I saw your coat, your shoes, your age, your race, and I placed you beneath me before you had finished speaking. Then I called that judgment humor. When you refused to accept the place I assigned you, I called your dignity arrogance. When I learned your name, I changed my tone. That was not respect. That was fear. The room outside carried on quietly. A scanner beeped. Someone laughed softly over an old photograph. Annie felt the letter pulling the noise farther away. I cannot honestly say I understood all of this when I sat in the Baltimore archive. I wanted to survive the moment. I wanted to say enough to stop the bleeding. But Mr. Leonard Price asked me whether I regretted disrespecting you before or after I knew your name. I have not been able to put that question down. Annie looked up. Clara's eyes had narrowed, not with anger now, but attention. Martin said, "Keep going." Annie did. "I do not ask to purchase the suitcase. I do not ask for a meeting with your grandmother. I do not ask that the Whitaker, Rose family, reopen discussions with me or my companies. I forfeited that. I am writing because you told my counsel that I should read an apology in a room where nobody could benefit me. I did. I read it first in my office. It sounded false. I read it in my boardroom. It sounded strategic. I read it in the kitchen of my childhood home, which I have not entered in 9 years. To my older sister, she told me it still sounded like a press release and made me start over. Despite herself, Annie almost smiled. Clara noticed. A sister can do what lawyers cannot, Martin murmured, often with less billing. Annie continued. My sister reminded me of something I had worked hard to forget. Our father was not a kind man to people he did not need. He was polished. He was respected. He gave money publicly, but he treated waiters, drivers, clerks, and cleaning women as if they were interruptions. I learned from him before I learned to question him. That explanation does not excuse me. It only tells you where some of the rot began. Annie's voice slowed. I am ashamed that it took a suitcase connected to something I wanted for me to see the person carrying it. I am ashamed that my first valuation of your family's history was $50 and a laugh. I am ashamed that I tried to convert that shame into a larger offer, as if enough money could make the first number disappear. Marlene appeared at the office door but stopped when she saw their faces. Clara waved her in silently. Annie finished the last paragraph. I will not attend the exhibit again, unless invited. I will not challenge the trust, the documents, the stewardship program, or your family's control of the materials. Hawthorne Capital will withdraw all current and pending overtures related to Orion Group. Separately, I am placing funds into an independent preservation trust selected by community archivists, with no Hawthorne naming rights, no board seat, and no publicity beyond legally required disclosure. This does not purchase forgiveness. It is not repayment. It is the first useful thing I could think to do, after doing harm. The letter ended with one final line. You were valuable before I knew your name. I was wrong before I knew your name. I am sorry. Annie lowered the paper. No one rushed to speak. That, more than anything, told her the letter had weight. If it had been empty, Clara would have named the emptiness immediately. Marlene folded her arms. Well, Martin said, legally this is useful. Annie looked at him. Of course that's the first thing you say. It is not the first thing I thought. What did you think? Martin took off his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth. I thought Leonard Price may have done more in one question than Richard's board did in 7 years. Clara held out her hand. Annie gave her the letter. Clara read it herself, slowly. When she finished, she set it on her lap. Do you believe him? Annie asked. Clara looked toward the reading room. I believe he wrote a better letter than he was capable of writing last week. That's not an answer. It is the only honest one. Repentance is not a sentence. It is a pattern. We have 1 page. We will see whether he can become consistent. Annie sat down in the chair across from her. She felt tired in a different way now. Anger had direction. This was harder. An apology, even an imperfect but real one, asked something of the person who received it. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. But care. The care not to turn pain into a permanent identity simply because it had once been righteous. Marlene spoke gently. You don't owe him comfort, baby. I know. You don't owe him a meeting. I know that too, Clara added. And you do not owe him the privilege of becoming central to this story. Annie looked through the office window at the archive tables. A young man was scanning a stack of letters tied with twine while his grandmother corrected his handling. A little girl sat on the floor with a notebook, drawing the burned suitcase from memory. Leonard Price was near the back, talking to two engineering students who listened like every word might be on the exam. He's not central, Annie said. But the letter matters. Yes, Clara said. It does. What should I do? Clara gave her the answer Annie hated most. Decide what kind of woman you want to become before you decide what to do with a man's apology. That stayed with her for the rest of the afternoon. At 4 o'clock, Annie found Leonard Price sitting near the exhibit case, cane across his knees, watching visitors pass the suitcase. She sat beside him without asking. He glanced at her. You look like somebody handed you a box you weren't expecting. A letter. From him? Yes. Was it sorry or sorry looking? Annie laughed once. That's a good question. I'm old. We collect good questions after we run out of patience. She handed him a copy Martin had made. Leonard read slowly. His lips moved over some of the words. When he finished, he folded the pages and returned them. Well? Annie asked. He found a piece of the road. Only a piece? Leonard tapped his cane lightly against the floor. Child, if a man's been walking the wrong direction for 50 years, don't throw him a parade because he turned his head. But don't pretend turning doesn't matter either. Annie looked at the suitcase. Do you think I should answer? Yes. What should I say? The truth. Shorter than his. That evening, after the archive closed, Annie sat at Marlene's desk with Clara, Martin, and Leonard waiting in the reading room. She wrote by hand because typing felt too easy. Mr. Hawthorne, I received your letter. I believe it is the first thing you have given this matter that was not trying to purchase control over it. I do not forgive you today. I do not reopen any door to Orion. I do not accept money as apology, and I do not mistake withdrawal for transformation. But I acknowledge the letter. I acknowledge the sentence. You were valuable before I knew your name. Keep that sentence, where your first offer used to be. Let it make you uncomfortable long enough to change your habits. If your preservation trust is truly independent, let community archivists lead it. If there are no naming rights, keep them absent. If there is no publicity, do not let your people leak your generosity through side doors. Do the work quietly. Let time decide whether it was real. Annie Whitaker rose. She read it aloud once. Clara nodded. Martin nodded. Leonard nodded last. Good, Leonard said. Didn't give him sugar. Didn't give him poison either. Annie folded the letter. Outside the archive windows, Baltimore settled into evening. The suitcase stood behind glass, burned and scuffed. No longer silent. People had come all day to see it, but many had left talking about their own drawers, their own boxes, their own family papers waiting to be believed. Annie looked at the outgoing envelope on the desk and understood something she had not understood at Whitmore. Justice was not always the moment a powerful man fell. Sometimes justice was the slower work of making sure he could not remain the same without hearing the truth scrape against him every time he moved. Richard's answer came through Martin 2 days later, though it was not really an answer. It was a legal notice confirming that Hawthorne Capital would withdraw all active acquisition approaches related to Orion Group and its controlled entities. It was signed by Daniel Voss, witnessed by 2 attorneys, and written in the cold language of men closing a door they wished they could pretend had been theirs to close. Martin read it at the archive's back table while Annie, Clara, Marlene Carter, and Leonard Price listened. He withdraws all present and pending overtures, Martin said. Agrees not to contact Orion board observers, trust advisors, or family representatives for a period of 10 years. Acknowledges no right of access to founding materials. Waives claims arising from the Baltimore exhibit, the Whitmore auction record, and public presentation of authenticated trust documents. Leonard leaned back in his chair. That sounds like a man leaving with his hat in his hand. Martin lowered the paper. That sounds like a man whose lawyers finally found the fire exit. Marlene smiled. Clara did not. She looked at Annie, because this victory belonged to her more than to the attorneys. Annie expected to feel triumph. Instead, she felt a quiet loosening in her shoulders, as if a weight had stepped away but left its shape behind. Richard Hawthorne had not been destroyed. Men like him rarely were. He would still own buildings, appear at conferences, sit on boards, and receive calls from people who believed repentance and public relations were cousins. But the thing he wanted most had been placed beyond his reach, and not by a larger fortune or a louder man. By a girl he had priced at $50 before he knew her name. Clara reached for the document. File it with the trust records. Martin slid it into a folder. Already prepared. Of course it is. Annie looked toward the exhibit room. Through the open door, Visitors moved slowly around the suitcase. A man in a mechanic's jacket was showing his teenage grandson the scuff mark. An older woman stood before the photograph of Augustus Whitaker with both hands clasped around the strap of her purse. At the scanning table, a volunteer helped a retired postal worker flatten letters from his mother, who had run a boarding house for black railway porters in the 1940s. The work had outgrown Richard. That afternoon, the first grants from the Augustus Whitaker Stewardship Program were announced. Not on a stage. No ribbon cutting. No oversized check. Marlene read the names in the archive reading room while coffee brewed in the corner and rain tapped against the windows. A church in West Baltimore would receive funds to preserve baptism records and handwritten meeting minutes dating back to 1913. A retired teacher would receive help digitizing notebooks from a segregated school her mother attended. A neighborhood barbershop, still run by the founder's grandson, would preserve appointment ledgers that doubled as informal voter registration records during years when men shared news under the sound of clippers. A small family funeral home would restore photographs nearly lost to basement damp. 2 students would be trained in archival handling over the summer and paid for their labor. When Marlene finished, no one clapped at first. The room was too full. Then Mrs. Freeman began, slow and firm, and the applause followed her. Annie stood near the back, listening. Clara came beside her. Now you see why 10 million can be larger than 200. Annie nodded, because it knows where to stand. Yes, Leonard Price, who had been given a front row chair he pretended not to need, turned around and pointed his cane at Annie. Don't hide back there, young lady. If you start something, you ought to stand close enough to hear it breathe. Annie laughed and came forward. A woman from the church took her hand. My grandmother signed those meeting minutes. Her hand is in that book. I thought nobody outside our basement would ever care. Annie squeezed her fingers. Your grandmother cared. That was enough to start with. The woman's eyes filled. Still feels good to have help. It does, Annie said. Later, when the visitors thinned and the rain stopped, Martin found Annie in front of the suitcase. There's one more thing. She turned. From Richard? No, from Evelyn Price. Annie's expression softened. Martin handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the $50 bill, still in its clear evidence sleeve, along with a handwritten note. Miss Whitaker rose. I should have stopped him sooner. That is a sentence I will have to live with. I have enclosed the bill as promised, logged and witnessed. Use it however you think best. I have managed auctions for 41 years. I thought I knew the difference between price and value. It turns out I only knew the vocabulary. With respect, Evelyn Price. Annie read the note twice. She didn't have to write this. Clara, who had come close enough to hear, said, that is why it matters. Leonard squinted at the bill. What you going to do with that ugly little thing? Annie looked at it. For days, the bill had represented the insult, the first honest number, the cheapness of Richard's judgment. She had imagined it framed beside the suitcase as evidence. Part of her still wanted that. But looking at the grants announced that afternoon, she understood the bill could do better work than accusation. She turned to Marlene. Can we start a small box at the front desk? For what? Copies, postage, gloves, acid-free folders. The little things people don't ask for because they think help has to come in big checks. Marlene's face warmed. We can. Annie held up the bill. Then this is the first donation. Leonard chuckled. That man tried to buy history and ended up buying folders. Not buying, Annie said. Contributing without permission. Clara smiled. A fitting demotion. They placed the $50 bill in a simple frame near the intake desk, not in the main exhibit, not beside the founding allocation, not where Richard's name could take more room than it deserved. Beneath it, Marlene wrote a small label. First gift to the community preservation box, given without understanding its value. Visitors noticed it. Some smiled. Some shook their heads. By the end of the week, the box held crumpled ones, $5 bills, checks from retirees, a roll of quarters from a child, and an envelope from Mrs. Freeman containing $20 and a note that read, for somebody's grandmother's papers. The story changed after that. Reporters still came for Richard, but they stayed for the people in line with shoeboxes. Business programs still talked about Orion, but local papers wrote about church ledgers, workers' maps, black draftsmen, women who kept receipts, and elders who remembered names that never made it into annual reports. Richard's apology was quoted for a few days, then less often. His preservation initiative launched quietly months later, without his name on the building, because Annie's reply had made naming rights too costly to defend. Whether it changed him, nobody could say. But it changed what he could do in public without hearing the echo of $50. One evening near the end of the exhibit's first month, Annie arrived after closing and found Clara alone in the gallery. Her grandmother stood before the suitcase, one hand resting on her cane. "You're tired," Annie said. "I am old. Tired is part of the furniture." Annie stood beside her. "Do you miss when it was private?" Clara did not answer quickly. "Sometimes. Privacy protected us. And now? Now witness protects what privacy could only hide." They looked at the suitcase together. Burned side, bent lock, old handle, new scuff. Behind it, enlarged on the wall, was the photograph Mrs. Freeman had brought. Augustus Whitaker standing outside the office, hat in hand, a serious man whose work had finally found more names to stand with it. Clara spoke softly. "When I was your age, my father told me there were two ways a family loses history. One is when enemies take it. The other is when descendants fear the cost of showing it." Annie touched the glass lightly. "Were you afraid?" "Yes." That answer surprised her. Clara looked at her. "Courage is not the absence of fear, child. It is deciding what fear does not get to own." Annie thought of Whitmore Grand Hall, the laughter, the bill, the kick, the moment the lid opened and the room changed. She had believed then that the suitcase was about proving Richard wrong. It had been, for a while. But now it was about all the people who came to the archive carrying grocery bags, tins, envelopes, and stories, asking in quiet voices whether what they had saved mattered. It did. All of it did. Before they left, Annie stopped at the intake desk. The community preservation box sat there with its small label and its growing weight of modest gifts. A little handwritten card had been taped beside it by one of the student volunteers. "No history is too small to be handled with care." Annie read it and smiled. Outside, Baltimore's evening had turned cool. Clara's car waited at the curb. Martin was on the phone nearby, speaking in his calm lawyer's voice to someone who probably needed to be told no politely. Annie looked back through the archive window. She could see the suitcase under the soft light, not hidden, not restored into prettiness, not stripped of its scars. It stood open enough for memory, closed enough for protection. The world had called it trash when it did not know what it carried. Now people came from miles away to bring their own fragile proof and ask someone to help them keep it safe. That, Annie thought, was better than selling it for any number Richard Hawthorne could have named. A year later, the suitcase returned to Newport, not to Whitmore Grand Hall. Clara refused that suggestion before Martin finished saying it. The gala organizers had offered the room at no cost, with a formal apology from the board and a promise that the event would reclaim the narrative. Clara listened, thanked them, and said the narrative had never belonged to the chandeliers. So the suitcase came home to a quieter place, the new public wing of the Whitaker, Rose Family Archive, a brick carriage house converted into reading rooms, preservation labs, and a small exhibition hall open 3 days a week. There was no red carpet on opening morning, no champagne, no orchestra, just coffee and paper cups, folding chairs, a local high school choir, and a line of visitors that stretched past the garden gate before the doors opened. Annie stood near the entrance wearing a navy dress and flat shoes. Not old clothes this time, not armor either, just herself. She greeted elders first, because Clara insisted a room always found its manners by watching how it treated the oldest people in it. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Annie said when Evelyn arrived. Evelyn smiled, smaller than she used to, but real. "Good morning, Miss Whitaker, Rose. You came a long way." I owed the suitcase a proper hello. Annie stepped aside and let her in. Leonard Price came next, leaning on his cane, Janie at his elbow. He looked around the new wing and gave a low whistle. "Well now, Mr. Gus got himself a room," Annie laughed. "More than one. Good. He drew enough foundations for other folks." Inside, the suitcase stood in the center of the first gallery, still burned, still bent, still bearing the mark from Richard's shoe. The glass case was simple. The label was shorter than Annie expected when she first approved it. "Fire case of Augustus Whitaker. Carried from the Baltimore office fire, 1921. Publicly dismissed as worthless in Newport nearly a century later. Preserved as evidence that value does not begin when power recognizes it, Beside the case was a screen showing scanned documents from the stewardship program. Church minutes, barbershop ledgers, school notebooks, funeral home photographs, rent receipts, union cards, recipes written on paper sacks, letters from sons in uniform, and land deeds kept in family Bibles. The exhibit was no longer only about Orion. It had become what Leonard warned Annie to protect: a house with many rooms. Richard Hawthorne did not attend. He sent no flowers, no statement, no donation with his name hidden in paperwork. Months earlier, Martin had confirmed that Richard's Independent Preservation Trust had been funded and placed under a board selected by archivists and community historians. No Hawthorne name appeared. No press release followed. Annie did not call that redemption. Clara would not allow words that large to be spent cheaply. But it was a fact, and facts deserved their place. Near noon, Annie stepped to the front of the room to speak. Clara sat in the first row, hands folded over her cane. Martin stood in the back, as always, watching doors and details. Evelyn sat beside Mrs. Freeman. Leonard sat with his cane across his knees, already looking impatient with ceremony. Annie looked at the faces before her. Old, young, black, white, wealthy, working class, neighbors, archivists, students, people who came because they loved history, and people who came because they had once been laughed at for keeping something others called useless. When I first carried this suitcase into a public room, Annie said, most people saw the burns before they wondered about the hands that carried it. That is human, I suppose. We often notice damage before we ask what survived. The room settled, but the mistake is not in seeing the burn. The mistake is deciding the burn is the whole story. She glanced at the case. My family kept this suitcase private for many years. Privacy protected it. But Baltimore taught us that witness can protect things too. Since the stewardship program began, families have brought us more than 12,000 items. Not all of them are famous. Most never will be. But fame is not the measure of memory. A church ledger can hold a neighborhood together. A rent receipt can prove a family stayed when the record says they vanished. A recipe can carry a grandmother's hand. A photograph can return a name to a face. An older woman in the second row nodded and wiped her eyes. Annie continued. The suitcase was never worth $1 million because of leather, metal, or fire. It was worth that because it carried authorship, dignity, and proof. And now I know it carried one more thing. It carried a question for every person who saw it. What have you called worthless because you did not understand it yet? She paused long enough for the question to breathe. Leonard lifted his cane slightly. That'll preach. The room laughed, and Annie laughed too. After the speech, the choir sang a hymn Clara requested. Not because the event was religious, but because she said some songs knew how to hold grief without dropping it. People moved through the gallery slowly. They bent over labels. They pointed out names. They told stories in low voices and corrected each other gently. No, baby. That was your great aunt, not your cousin. Your grandfather worked that line. My mother had handwriting just like that. Late in the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned, a boy of about 10 stood before the suitcase with his grandfather. He stared at the scuff mark for a long time. Why didn't they fix that part, he asked. Annie heard the question from across the room and stopped walking. The grandfather looked at the mark, then at Annie, then back at the boy. Because sometimes fixing a thing too pretty makes folks forget what happened to it. The boy frowned. But it still looks hurt. It is, the grandfather said. That's why you be careful with what other people carry. Annie turned away before they could see what the words did to her. Clara found her near the window a few minutes later. You are quiet. I was listening. That is a family habit. Sometimes it feels heavy. It should, Clara said. Light history is usually missing pieces. They stood together while the afternoon light moved across the floor. Annie watched Evelyn Price stop before the community preservation box, which had been placed near the exit with its first $50 bill reproduced under glass. Evelyn dropped in a folded check, then stood still for a moment before leaving. Do you think people change? Annie asked. Clara followed her gaze. Some do. Some only behave better when watched. Time sorts them. And Richard? Clara considered that. Richard lost what he wanted. That is consequence. Whether he becomes different is not ours to manage. Annie nodded slowly. Clara touched her arm. Do not tie your peace to a proud man's improvement. That is a poor investment. Annie smiled. You always make morality sound like finance. At my age, one uses the tools available. Near closing, Martin approached with a small envelope. This came by mail this morning. I screened it. Annie recognized Richard's handwriting before Martin said the name. She opened it alone near the suitcase. Miss Whitaker rose. The trust has completed its first round of grants. I did not attend the announcement. I did not issue a statement. Daniel tells me this is the first time in 30 years I have paid for something useful and resisted putting my name on it. I still think about Leonard Price's question. That is all. Richard Hawthorne. Annie read it twice, then folded it. Clara watched from a few feet away. Well, he is still turning his head, Annie said. Not a parade. Clara replied. No, not a parody. Annie placed the letter in her bag, not the exhibit. Richard did not belong in the center. The suitcase did. As evening came, the last visitors left. The staff turned off the screen displays one by one. The gallery softened into quiet. Leonard was the final guest to leave, moving slowly toward the door with Janie beside him. At the threshold, he turned back. Miss Annie. Yes, sir? You kept the scuff. Yes, sir. Good. Some marks ought to make liars uncomfortable. Then he winked and went out. Annie stood alone before the suitcase after everyone else had gone to the reception room. The burned leather held the low light. The lock looked dark and stubborn. The handle, worn by hands long dead, still curved upward as if waiting to be carried again. She thought of the night at Whitmore when laughter had filled the hall and Richard Hawthorne had believed $50 could dismiss what he did not understand. She thought of the bill striking his tuxedo. The kick. The click of the lock. The way silence fell when the lid opened. She thought of Baltimore, Leonard's cane, Mrs. Freeman's photograph, Clara's fear, Evelyn's note, the first crumpled dollars in the preservation box, and the people who came with shoeboxes asking whether their history mattered. It did. That was the answer the suitcase had been carrying all along. Not just mine, not just ours, yours too. Whatever they laughed at, whatever they told you was too damaged, too ordinary, too late, too small. Look again, handle it with care. Ask what survived. Annie rested her hand lightly on the glass. The price of a thing is what someone offers before they understand it. The value of a thing is what remains after their money no longer matters. Behind her, Clara called from the doorway. Child, are you coming? Annie looked once more at the suitcase, at the burn and the scuff and the stubborn shape of it. Yes, ma'am, she said. Then she turned off the last light herself, leaving the suitcase in the dark, not as something hidden, but as something finally safe. The lesson of Annie's story is simple. Never judge a person, a family, or a piece of history by how damaged it looks on the outside. Richard Hawthorne saw an old burned suitcase and a young woman in worn clothes, so he decided both were beneath him. But true value does not wait for wealth, status, or power to recognize it. Some of the most important things in life are carried quietly by people the world is too quick to dismiss. Respect should not begin only after we discover someone's name, money, or influence. It should begin the moment they stand before us as a human being. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.